I was just heading home from school when things started to get messy. Oops, Ma would have a fit if she heard me speak like that. It was a bit unusual for me to still be in school at 11 years old, especially since that was old enough to have a full-time job in Texas in the spring of 1871. I'd been attending school on and off for nearly 5 years, so I knew enough to teach just as well as the schoolmarm. The school was 3 miles from home, so I was riding our old mule, Jehoshaphat, and taking my time. I had plenty of time to finish my chores before supper, so I was lost in my thoughts, enjoying the beautiful day. That is, until I heard the gunshots. That sure got my attention. I urged Jehoshaphat to pick up the pace, but that poor mule could only move so fast. After a while, I realized Jehoshaphat just wasn't fast enough, so I hopped off and started running as fast as I could. I was sure glad I had my .44 caliber Star DA, double-action, pistol in a cross-draw holster on my left hip instead of tied down to my thigh. To be honest, that gun was so heavy, I wouldn't have been able to carry it there without it dragging my pants down. With the holster on my left hip, I could run much faster than if it were strapped to my thigh. I ran up close to the house and saw Pa lying dead in the front yard and 4 men firing their pistols at the house. There was a lot of shooting coming from inside the house, so I figured that my 2 older brothers, John and Benjamin, were shooting with Ma and Florence reloading for them. The men attacking the house were sheltering behind the well and some other stuff in the front yard. There was a little draw crossing in front of the house, so I ran to that and jumped in. It was only about 3 feet deep, but I was only about 5 feet tall, so I had no trouble bending over far enough to be protected from the flying bullets. I ran down the draw until I was as close to the attackers as I could get and still be in the draw. I leaned against the side of the draw and drew my pistol. There were 4 men less than 15 yards away, and I had 5 shots. I was supremely confident as I got ready to shoot. The recoil from that .44 caliber pistol was a caution, so I always held it with 2 hands. Since it was double action, I didn't have to worry about cocking the hammer. All I had to do was pull the trigger. I lined up on the first gullet and pulled the trigger real gentle-like. I'd done a lot of shooting to learn how to handle that pistol, but this was the first time I had shot at a man. That gun was old, but it was smooth as a woman's cheek, as my pa used to say. The trigger came back and the hammer rose. At the proper moment, the hammer fell on the cap, and the gun fired that lead ball into the back of the head of the scumsucker shooting at my family. I paused only long enough to see that I did not need a second shot at that target and swung the gun to point at the next man in line. He had not reacted to my shot, probably because he had not noticed it among the other shots being fired that afternoon. Still holding the gun in both hands, I let it fall from the recoil position to point at this man's head. As soon as I was sure of my line, I again pulled the trigger. This bullet also ran true and hit the gullet in the side of his head behind his right ear. Scratch another of the scumsuckers. The third man finally noticed something when he was hit in the hand by several drops of blood and maybe some splattered brains. He turned to look in the direction of the dead man, and it was almost comical to see the look of surprise on his face when he realized that his companion was dead. Well, that was the last of my headshots. The man had turned far enough now that he had exposed his chest as a target. Pa had drilled into me that I should shoot at the biggest target, since a man never knew if his bullet was going to fly true. With this admonition in mind, I took aim on the center of the man's chest and let fly with my third shot. He died quickly, and I was left with the fourth man. However, this was not as clear-cut and straightforward as the first 3 men had been. The fourth man jumped around to get some protection from my shot, and he jumped too high. He was caught in the body by 2 lead balls and killed soon enough. Now, the shooting could stop. I shouted, "Don't shoot, please. It's only me, Nathan." An answer came from the house, so I climbed out of the draw and inspected the 4 bodies to make sure that they were dead. That was another of Pa's admonitions, namely, always make sure that your enemy ain't faking death. By this time, Ma, Florence, John, and Benjamin were seeing if there was anything that could be done for Pa. I could tell by the tears from all 4 of them that there was nothing to be done, that Pa was already dead. Of course, I started to cry at that realization, and I wished that all 4 of the scumsuckers were alive so that I could put another lead ball in their guts. It was hard to do through my tears, but I followed another of Pa's admonitions to reload my weapon as soon as possible. You never knew who or how many more enemies might be sneaking up on your back. About this time, Jehoshaphat wandered up to the barn and started braying that he was ready to eat. Pa always said that a man should take care of his mount first, before his own needs, so I went to take care of Jehoshaphat. He had always been a faithful friend and companion, so I owed it to him. John and Benjamin carried Pa's body into the house for Ma and Florence to start preparing him for burial. Once they had done that, they dragged the bodies of the 4 attackers into the barn. Jehoshaphat wasn't happy as soon as he smelled the blood, But the boys ignored him and went about the business of stripping the dead men of anything they had of value. That's when they found out that the 4 men worked for Oliver Carter, a carpetbagger who was trying to buy up all of the land for miles around. Pa had refused on at least 3 occasions to sell our place to Carter, so maybe that's why his men murdered Pa. I met my brothers in the kitchen where we drank coffee and discussed the situation. They told me that 5 men had ridden up to the house and called to Pa to come out to talk. Pa was always the polite sort, so he went out as requested. Pa had hardly gotten both feet on the ground from stepping off the veranda when all 5 of the men drew pistols and fired balls into his body from only a few feet away. John had seen this from inside the house, so he grabbed up a loaded Mississippi rifle that always hung on a rack beside the front door. John had shot at 1 man, but they had all ducked behind shelter before John could reload the muzzle loader and fire again. The man he shot at had been wounded in the arm, so he had climbed on his horse and ridden away. The battle against the other 4 men had commenced, and I was around for the end of it. There was no question that one of us was going to have to call out Oliver Carter. As it happened to be, even though I was the youngest of the 3 brothers, I was the best shot and the fastest draw, so it was obvious that I was the logical choice to be the one who challenged Carter. Even Ma agreed to that when she came into the room after finishing washing Pa and getting him dressed in his best suit. I planned to go into Edgar Junction and duel Carter the first thing tomorrow. First thing, we had to bury Pa before he started to smell too bad. The church in Edgar Junction didn't have a regular full-time preacher. Instead, a Methodist circuit rider came around every 4th week for a Sunday service that we were obliged to hold on Wednesdays because of his schedule. Anyway, he wasn't due for another 3 weeks, and Pa couldn't wait that long. Therefore, we were going to have to bury Pa without a preacher in attendance. Well, it wouldn't be the first time that a funeral in Hunter County was held without a preacher. We already had a family cemetery, so it wasn't any mystery where Pa would be buried. The 3 of us boys went out and dug a grave before supper. We would hold the funeral tomorrow morning before I rode into Edgar Junction. The funeral was just for the family. Sure, Pa had lots of friends, but it wasn't practical for them to drop everything and rush to his funeral. A body had to make a living, and that was tough in Southwest Texas in 1871. So we had the funeral attended by his widow, his daughter, his 3 sons, and his dog, Jacob. We dried our eyes, and it was time for me to go. I figured that Jehoshaphat wasn't up to the long walk into town, so I saddled up one of the attacker's horses and rode him. I took along the man's beautifully maintained Benjamin rifle. The man also had a Colt Navy which I fastened to my thigh as a kind of decoy. I figured that there was a chance that Carter would pay so much attention to that gun on my thigh that he wouldn't notice my real weapon at my left waist. I rode the 11 miles into town at a fast clip because I hoped to get back home for noon dinner. It was pushing 10:30 when I got to Carter office, so I didn't have much time to fool around. I dismounted and tied up the horse at the hitching post near enough to the watering trough. I'd ridden fast enough that I figured the horse might be a mite thirsty. Carter wasn't in his office, so I guessed that he might be at the nearest saloon, which was the fanciest in town. I went there and found Carter sitting at a table with 2 toughs, what I figured to be his bodyguards. Well, I hadn't figured on fighting 3 men, but I was sure I could handle it. Now, 4 men would have been a problem. I was careful where I stood when I said in a firm voice, loud enough to be heard in the whole saloon, "Oliver Carter, I'm calling you out for murdering my pa yesterday. Stand up and draw." Carter ignored my challenge, but the rest of the patrons didn't. They dove for the floor if they were in the line of fire, but everybody wanted to watch to see the fun. Some of them knew of my prowess with a handgun, but most of them expected me to be dead in a few seconds. Nobody was sympathetic about my young age. I was a man if I carried a gun the way I did. I said, "Carter, if you don't stand and draw, I'll kill you just the way you did my pa now. Do it." Carter turned to one of his bodyguards and said, "Kill him." The man slowly rose to his feet, not expecting a young person to handle a weapon as skillfully as an experienced professional. I was about to prove him wrong. He kept his weapon in the usual position at his side, so he needed to stand up fully to draw it comfortably. I allowed him to rise and make his move toward the weapon. Not wanting to give anything away, I kept my Colt Navy by my side. It was a bit inconvenient to have to cock the hammer with my thumb, but I made sure not to forget. I already had my gun drawn and cocked before he had completed his drawing motion. In a fit of bravado that Pa would have smacked me for, I shot him dead center in the belt buckle. It was no fluke. I was standing within 15 feet of the gullet, so he was well within my no-miss range. The lead ball hit him dead center on a fancy metal buckle and drove that into his gut ahead of the ball. The buckle tore a hole about the size of my fist on its way in, so I knew that I didn't have anything to worry about from him. He dropped in a bloody mess beside his boss, who now looked a little bit concerned. The other bodyguard didn't wait for orders. He jumped to his feet and tried to pull his gun, but he was no faster than his companion. At this point, I quit showing off and shot him right where I figured his heart would be. That Colt Navy wasn't as powerful as my .44, but it was sure adequate to the job. At a range of only about 15 feet, the ball shattered his breastbone, and the combination must have made a hell of a mess because he looked to be dead by the time he hit the floor. Now, Carter was real scared. On the other hand, my emotions were taking a holiday. This was no more exciting or frightening to me than target practice had been. I was just going through the necessary motions with Pa looking over my shoulder ready to criticize if I screwed up. Carter jumped up and pulled a Derringer from his vest pocket. I think that he really wanted to run, more than fight, but he knew that he was caught and couldn't escape. I didn't want him to get off easy with this, so I shot him in the right shoulder. That forced him to drop his gun before he even had time to cock it. The next shot, I put into his hip. I wanted him to take at least a week to die, every minute knowing that it was about to happen. Of course, I had forgotten that he would be doped up on laudanum the whole time, so he wouldn't know much. I looked around at the other patrons of the saloon, and they looked back at me. I don't know where it started, but suddenly, there was applause and cheers for my victory. There wasn't a man in town that didn't hate Carter guts. I tipped my hat to the crowd and proceeded to go through the pockets of the 3 corpses. The 2 bodyguards didn't have much, but I found a money belt around Carter, waist that later turned out to have $950 in it. The marshal came in and said, "Nathan, you better skedaddle. I saw the last part of the fight. I rule it as self-defense, but you better go home, just in case." I thanked the marshal for his sage advice and left for home. It was 17 days after the duel when the marshal came by the house. "Nathan, we got trouble. Oliver Carter had some powerful friends, and they managed to get a federal warrant for your arrest. I got a telegram today ordering me to arrest you for murder of the 3 men you shot the other day. I'm gonna say that you wasn't home when I came by to arrest you, but I do need fair you to light a shuck fair someplace else. I need this here job. I don't want to lose it." "Sure thing, Mr. Addison. I do appreciate your kindness in warning me. I'll be gone within the hour. Stay around for another cup of coffee if you like." "No, thank ya. I'd better be going. I don't want to know where you're headed. By the way, I hope you don't have a tintype lying around. We don't want them to come up with a wanted poster with your picture on it. Thanks for that advice. I'll talk to Ma about it, but I can't remember any. I speak very good Spanish, both the cultured language of the Hidalgo and the gutter language of the peon, so I figured that I should head for Mexico. My family helped me get the necessary stuff together. I took 2 riding horses and a pack horse. John and Benjamin needed the mules for plowing, so I didn't even think of taking them. We had 4 extra horses we had gotten from the attackers, so I took 3 of them and left the poorest of them for the boys to sell. I took $100 in eagles and Mexican silver for my expenses. That should cover me until I could get a job somewhere. It was with a heavy heart that I left, but I had to do it to save my family way too much bother. At least, I would be arrested and put on trial, and if Carter's friends were powerful enough, I would be found guilty of something. My best bet was to vanish for a few years, but I promised to check in with them as often as I could. I made a beeline for Mexico and got there in 2 days. This was my first trip to Mexico, but my Spanish had been perfected by talking to local workers and practice in school. I learned the Hidalgo style in school, and I learned the common style from the workers. We would all laugh when I would say something much too highfalutin for their speaking style. I was comfortable in the language, but not in the country. I guess it's what you were used to, but I was very uncomfortable with the very obvious class structure in Mexico, at least in the part where I was. I had trouble getting a job, and even more trouble holding it because I would not adapt to the patron attitude. Well, it looked like I had to return to the States or die of starvation, though I still had most of that $100 I had left home with. I decided to head into New Mexico territory to test my luck there. It had to be better than what I was doing in Mexico. I'm not sure exactly where I crossed the border, since it wasn't all that well defined. I came to a road and followed that until I came to a signpost with the arrow pointing north and the legend Las Cruces 20 miles. Well, that seemed like a good choice, so I headed that way. I had gone about 7 miles when I spotted a stage hold up ahead of me. 4 bandits in Mexican garb were surrounding a stagecoach. Suddenly, 2 shots were fired and the driver and shotgun guard fell to the ground, probably dead. The bandits were so intent on their prey that they never spotted me as I rode toward them. I managed to get within 75 yards and behind a little ridge when I heard a woman scream. A moment or 2 later, there was a scream from another woman and then a gunshot. I took my hat off and stuck my head up over that ridge just far enough to see what was going on. A dead Anglo man was lying in the dust near the door of the stage, and there were two naked women being held by the bandits. Well, they were still wearing their stockings and boots, plus their bonnets, but their dresses had been cut and ripped off. It was obvious that assault was next on the agenda. One of the women was being forced to her knees in front of one of the bandits. I didn't recognize what was going on until the man dropped his pants and forced the woman's head. Oh well, the woman obviously didn't like it, so it was up to me to put a stop to it. I drew a careful bead with the sights on my Benjamin and shot the man who was doing that woman. The bullet hit him between the shoulder blades, and he knocked the woman over backwards when he fell. The dead man also knocked back the other man who was holding that woman, so I ignored him for the moment. The other two men were getting ready to assault the second woman, so I quickly shifted my attention to them. Fortunately, it only took 2 shots to put them out of action, so I was able to shift my attention to the one remaining bandit on his feet. The powder smoke had given my position away, so he knew where to shoot. He managed to get off one shot as I was lining up a shot on him. Pa had always said that your first shot doesn't have to kill, but it has to hit. Well, I still had plenty of bullets left in my Benjamin, so I wasn't worried about running out of ammunition anytime soon. I snapped a shot at the fourth bandit and hit him in the left arm, not the one holding the pistol. Nevertheless, the shock of the bullet strike was enough to make him drop his pistol and grab at the wounded arm. This gave me plenty of time to put a bullet into his chest. He fell down with blood spurting, so I knew that I had made a significant hit. Both women were sitting on the ground where they had fallen and crying up a storm. I didn't blame them. I would have been scared to death by that experience if it had happened to me. I wanted to make them feel better, so I called out to them that I had come to help them. They both kind of screamed and squealed at the same time and jumped up to run to me. Now, I don't know about y'all, but this was my first time to experience being hugged by 2 naked women. Yep, them tits did feel good pressing into me, and I got my first hard-on from a woman's touch, but I didn't know what to do about it. I laid my rifle down and hugged them back. That was the first time the women realized that they were taller than me. One of them said, "He's only a boy." The other one said, "That may be, but he sure knows how to shoot." That kind of broke the spell, and one of them said, "Can you help us find some more clothes?" I asked if they had luggage aboard the coach, and both said that they did. I went to the boot of the coach and pulled out some baggage. The women found their own carpet bags and proceeded to pull out dresses to slip on. Now that they were covered, the women seemed to come to themselves and to start acting like adults. Nevertheless, they both acted like I was still in charge. I guess that was because I was the only ambulatory male, and I had proved my prowess in battle. I was a mite surprised, but, for whatever reason, the 2 women still looked to me for directions. I asked them to identify themselves and the man lying in the dust. They said that they were sisters and the man was their brother. They lived in Las Cruces and had been traveling to El Paso to visit relatives. It's a good thing that I am strong, because I had to do most of the work, though I did use the horses and a rope to help me with some of the most difficult parts of the job. The sisters and their brother were returned to the coach. The stage crew was hoisted back into the driver's box, and the bandits were tied across their saddles. I had no idea how to drive a team of 6 mules, so I put the team on a lead rope and led them back to Las Cruces. It took the rest of the day, but we did get there before dark. I took the stage to their office, and that was when I found out about the reward of $25 for every bandit I killed while he was robbing a stage. I was delighted to get the $100 and figured that this was the easiest way I ever heard of to get money. I figured that it was even easier than stealing it. Ah, the ignorance of youth. Anyway, the sisters were returned to their family, and I went on my way after receiving profuse thanks for my deeds. I was a little embarrassed, but I did appreciate the thanks. When I expressed my desire to the stage management to make more money from killing bandits, they suggested that I look into bounty hunting. When I said that I didn't know how that worked, I was told to go around to the clerk's office in the courthouse and I could get all of the information I needed. So, that's what I did. The next morning, I went to the courthouse and found the clerk. He explained that there was nothing that I had to do to register as a bounty hunter or anything like that. All I had to do was to deliver a wanted person who was listed on a poster to a sheriff or marshal and get a receipt. Upon delivery of the receipt to the clerk's office, I would be paid the bounty. I was warned that most of the bounties were in the $25 to $50 range, but a few were for $1,000 or more. Obviously, the higher the bounty, the more dangerous was the wanted person. This sounded good, so I asked for a supply of wanted posters and took them back to my room at the hotel. In my naivete, I had not realized that many of the wanted posters had no picture, and, among those, I found my own poster without a picture. A $50 reward was offered for my capture, alive, but there was no reward for me dead. That was a relief. The description was so vague that it was useless, so I relaxed. I figured that if I changed my name, I would be safe. That's when I became John Benjamin, the Texas kid. Oh, to be 11 years old again. I went through the posters and sorted out the ones with pictures. There was quite a stack of these, so I didn't need the ones without pictures. Hell, if the description was too vague for even a drawing, then it was useless to me. I returned the unwanted posters to the clerk, and he laughed. Damn it, I can't get anybody to take the posters without pictures. I usually wind up using them to start a fire in my stove for coffee every morning. I had no idea how to start out bounty hunting, so the clerk suggested that I visit the saloons in town. Usually, the bartender is the first one to know when somebody new comes to town, especially if he is famous, and you can't be more famous than to have your picture on a wanted poster. I thanked the clerk for the advice and headed for the nearest saloon. In this enlightened age, you might think that it was hard for an 11-year-old boy to get into a saloon. Not on your tintype. If he could walk, any male was welcomed into a saloon, but the same was not true for women. Any woman in a saloon was deemed, correctly, to be a prostitute and was treated as such unless there was a man along to defend her. Anyway, I went in and ordered a Mexican beer. I had developed the taste for it while in Mexico. The bartender was not busy, so I explained my problem and asked for his help. The bartender was highly amused until I pointed out that I had already killed 10 men, so he treated me much more seriously. The bartender did say that there were a couple of wanted men wandering around town, but they fell into the $25 or so category, so most bounty hunters were ignoring them. I figured, damn it, I had to start somewhere, so I asked for more information. The bartender did say that one of the men was currently in the jakes, but should return shortly. I thanked him and took my beer to a chair at the side of the room. It was not long before a man came back into the saloon and spent most of his time complaining that he had eaten too damned much chili the night before. The men all agreed and laughingly insisted that he stay downwind of them for the rest of the day. This was the man I wanted. I went over and stood about 12 feet away. I said, Theodore Clark, you are under arrest for assault and murder. Please come with me so that I don't have to shoot you. His cronies all started laughing, and one said, It looks like they got you, Jeff. The long arm of the law has arrived. Clark had ignored me until that remark. He'd had enough beer to be belligerent, so he turned around and looked right over my head. Okay, you scumsucker, where are you hiding? I said, Mr. Clark, I am the one here to arrest you. Please come with me. Hell, no, I ain't coming with ya. You ain't nothing but a kid. That is correct, Mr. Clark. I am the Texas kid, and I am a bounty hunter here to arrest you for your crimes. Go away, kid. I don't want to hurt ya. That is beside the point, Mr. Clark. You are under arrest and I am taking you with me to the sheriff's office. By this time, the whole saloon was staring at us and laying bets on how much longer Clark was going to put up with this aggravation. Well, anybody who had bet on Clark having a lot of patience lost his money because Clark suddenly moved to draw his gun. He stood up, knocking his chair on its back, and reached for his pistol. I had no trouble beating him to the draw with my Colt Navy. I am not sure why, but I continued to want to keep my cross draw a secret until I really needed it. I fired once, and this time, stuck to every rule that my pa had drilled into me. I shot quick, and I shot at the largest part of the target. I hit Mr. Clark just above the belly button, and he dropped to the floor without even having time to bring his pistol to full cock. I looked around to a stunned silence in the saloon. Nobody said anything, so I asked the bartender if I could borrow his swamper. The bartender was so shocked at the smoothness of my victory that he readily agreed. The swamper and I dragged the lifeless corpse to the sheriff's office only 100 yards away. I tipped the swamper 4 bits, and he went away happy. A deputy sheriff wrote up a receipt for me, and I went to the clerk's office to collect my $35 reward. The clerk paid me, and I was now, officially, a bounty hunter. I was very proud of myself. I went back to that same saloon, partly because I wanted to brag and show off a little, but also because I wanted to know if there was anyone else around that might be arrested. Well, I was a little bit disappointed at the reception that I got when I walked into the saloon. It had taken a couple of hours to do all of the paperwork and such to collect my reward, so this was a whole new bunch of patrons, and they didn't know me from Adam's Fox. Therefore, I didn't get any adulation from the crowd, but I did get newfound respect from the bartender. He was very helpful in enumerating the other possible lower echelon crooks that I might pick up if I hung around for a while. He also admitted that I should check in the other saloons to see what they might have to offer. He did make one other useful comment. If you really want to find a lot of crooks, go north to Las Vegas. The gold mines around there have really pulled in the galoots that most bounty hunters don't want to mess with. I thanked him for the advice and finished my beer. Las Cruces was a good-sized town. They had 6 saloons and 1 brothel. You could tell that this was going to be an important community with that much business going around. I decided to skip the brothel. For one thing, I wasn't sure just how welcome I would be there, since I was not in much of a position to be a valued customer. Still, it would take more than one day to check out 5 more saloons. I visited 2 more saloons that evening and talked to the bartenders. One bartender did say that I might be doing myself more harm than good by admitting right off that I was a bounty hunter. On the other hand, an 11-year-old bounty hunter was hard to take seriously, and I could probably trade on that until the novelty wore off. Nothing of interest showed up in either of these saloons, so I went to bed, still kind of pumped up over my first successful bounty hunt. I slept late, one of the few great perks of being self-employed. In fact, I slept so late that I missed breakfast. I woke up about 10 a.m. ravenously hungry. With no restaurant open that time of day, my only hope was to visit the saloons. Let me tell you, pickled egg and beer doesn't make a very good breakfast. Either I was going to have to get up early enough to eat in a regular restaurant, or sleep late enough to have my breakfast at noon. Well, whatever I eventually do, I'm going to have a big supper tonight instead of the skimpy sandwich I had last night. I got around to the last saloon at about 4 o'clock that afternoon. This was my last hope for more action in Las Cruces, so I was anxious to find something of interest. I had just walked in the door when a gunshot rang out and a ball passed through my shirt, just barely missing me. Pa had taught me how to handle this sort of thing. I drew my gun and dove to the floor at the same time. This was when it paid to be small. I'm sure that I disappeared from view as soon as I went down. I was betting my life on the fact that the shooter couldn't tell if I was dead or what. I scooted over under a table. God, I hate tobacco chewers who spit on the floor. I just got settled into place when a pair of legs suddenly appeared right beside my table. I tried to be as quiet as I could while I tried to see who the legs belonged to. Hoorah! That was one of the galoots worth $30. He was holding his gun in his hand and twisting around trying to find me. Somebody must have pointed out the table I was hiding under, since he bent over and poked his gun right in my face. In case I forgot to mention it, Pa had also given me extensive instruction in knife fighting, so I was ready with my Bowie knife. I jammed that knife up into the galoot's wrist as I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. He let out a scream like I had just castrated him with a spoon and pulled the trigger. Luckily, I ducked in time, but the muzzle flash did singe my hat brim. I must have had castration on the brain, because I poked my pistol up between his legs and pulled the trigger. Damn it, on top of everything else, I set his pants on fire. I pulled my knife out of where it was sticking through the galoot's wrist and into the table. He fell to the floor, just plain screaming bloody murder. The swamper ran over with his slop bucket and poured the water onto the burning pants. The fire went out, but not before the man's balls got well cooked. The marshal and a doctor showed up about the same time. Several witnesses and I told the marshal what happened, so the marshal congratulated me on a novel approach to self-defense. The doctor looked at the man's balls and said that he would normally have to cut them off, along with the man's tool, but the bullet had gone up through the bladder and into his gut. The doctor doubted that the man would live a week. He just prescribed all of the laudanum the man wanted, and to let him die in peace. The marshal helped me to haul the man to jail. There, he gave me a receipt that I could take to the clerk the next morning to get my money. It seemed to me that it was time to move on from Las Cruces. I had decided to take that bartender's advice and to head north to Las Vegas. Las Vegas was practically due north across the territory in the midst of the currently most productive New Mexico Territory gold fields. I agreed that Las Vegas was the place to go to find the 2-bit grifters and crooks. I had realized that I wouldn't get rich by going after the low-value crooks, but I could make a nice living at it. New Mexico Territory was a wonderful place at this time of year. By the time I got to Lincoln County, I was completely enraptured by the grass-covered plains. This was great cattle country. Even I could see that, and I was raised as a dirt farmer. I was riding along just enjoying being alive when I heard the sound of gunfire. From the sound, I could tell that both rifles and pistols were being used in the fight, for I was sure that was what it had to be. I topped a low hill and saw something I never expected to see. Indians attacking a small wagon train. The Indians looked to me like Comanches. I couldn't be sure, because I hadn't seen that many of them, but I was inclined to help the wagon train if I could. The wagons had been circled, so I knew that there were no army men with the train. Had there been, the wagons would have been in a rectangular arrangement, which was a much better alignment for defense. Yeah, I had never been in such a fight, but I remembered what Pa had said. The Comanches were up to their usual trick of staying on horseback while fighting. I wondered if they would ever learn, but I hoped that they didn't. There looked to be about 20 Indians. They were moving around so much that I couldn't get a good count from this distance. I looked around to see what I could do to be the most help. I spotted a little hill about 80 yards from where the wagon train was stopped. If I could get there without being seen, I could snipe at the Indians and knock off a few without being attacked. What I needed was a place where the Indians couldn't ride right over me, which was the advantage the Comanches hoped for by staying aboard their horses. That little hill looked like the place I needed. I started working my way toward the hill, and I saw a good place to stash my horses. I left them there and took my Benjamin, my extra ammunition, and my canteen up the hill. That damned hill was steeper than I had realized when I saw it from a distance. Of course, that was to my advantage, so I only bitched about the work I had to do getting up the hill. It only took a couple of minutes for me to get set up, and I was finally ready to start my own little war. The Indians were from 70 to 120 yards away, so I planned to shoot at the closer ones first. The problem was that I had to lead the riders as they passed across in front of me. It was too far to give serious thought to shooting at the riders, but I had a good chance to hit the horses. I began to shoot in a measured fashion because I had to work on getting my aim. I guess the people with the wagon train were trying to shoot the riders instead of the horses. Maybe they would get the idea once I started to score a few hits. My first shot was a miss, but my second shot knocked over a horse. The rider was caught completely by surprise and tumbled when the horse went down. He didn't move when he hit the ground, and he and his horse did a good job of confusing the run of the horses behind him as they tried to avoid the obstacles on the ground. My next shot only wounded the horse, but it stopped so suddenly that its rider went right over its head. He was also unmoving as he lay there, so I had accomplished my basic goal no matter what happened. I could see the war chief off to one side directing the attack. He was out of good range, about 150 yards, but I thought to try to take him out. If I could, I was almost certain that the attack would break up while the Indians decided what to do next. I braced against a large rock and carefully aimed at the Indian, not the horse. The bullet seemed to take forever to get to the target, but after what seemed like minutes for it to happen, the Indian slowly fell off his horse. I took that as a good sign, since he was not moving fast to dodge any more bullets. The rest of the Indians seemed to notice the loss of the chief right away, and they broke off the attack. They met over where the war chief had been and milled around for a while. After a few minutes, a Comanche came riding fast, but alone, toward the wagons. He did not seem aggressive, and it was soon apparent that all he wanted was the body of the dead warrior he was riding toward. The people of the wagon train held their fire, and the Comanche picked up his fallen comrade and rode off. More Indians came, one at a time, until all of the dead warriors had been picked up. When that was done, they rode away. This was when I scrambled back to my horses and rode over to the wagon train to see what was what. As I got close, I saw that this looked like a bunch of city folk who didn't know how to find their butts in broad daylight with both hands and a coach. I could see that I didn't want to get involved, so I rode by and waved as I passed. A few of the young people waved, but most of the older folks seemed to be trying to ignore me off the face of the earth. I didn't understand it, but I could let it slide. Very strange. I pulled into Las Vegas in mid-afternoon, so I had plenty of time to look the town over before dark. I found a livery stable and paid for keeping my 3 horses overnight. I figured that I didn't want to commit myself until I had a better feel for how things went in Las Vegas. The hotel room I found wasn't much to brag about, but the bed was soft enough. You could tell that Las Vegas was a gold-rich boom town. There seemed to be a saloon within a few steps, no matter which way you turned. I went into the saloon attached to the hotel and immediately saw 3 men on my wanted posters. None was priced over $50, but the 3, added up, were worth the trip to Las Vegas all by themselves. This time, I decided not to advertise that I was a bounty hunter when I talked to the bartender. I walked up to the bar and ordered a Mexican beer when the bartender got around to me. Here it was, close to supper time, and the bartender was too busy for a little conversation. That sure told me something about the town. I took my beer to a chair at the side of the room and sat down. Hardly had I got my butt settled when a Saloon 304 came over and said, "Hi, there. Ya interested in a good time?" I said, "Ma'am, I'm 11 years old, and there ain't nothing that you could do for me until I get a little older. I thought you looked kinda young. I'll spread the word and nobody will pester ya. Take care of yourself and come see me when you're a little older." "Thank you, ma'am. I'll keep that in mind." I looked around and saw 2 more men on my posters. Shit. It suddenly dawned on me that I was in the wrong place. I don't dare approach one of these men. The first time that word got around that I was a bounty hunter, I'd have 20 or 30 men trying to shoot me all at one time. The best thing that I could do for my health would be to leave town quietly tomorrow morning and chalk this up as a learning experience. I could hear Pa laughing at me and saying, "The Texas kid learned something on his own for a change. Maybe he will live long enough to grow up, after all." As I got up to leave for supper, I saw a handbill lying in a chair a few steps down from where I had been sitting. I'm one of those people who reads everything he can find, so I picked it up to read. It was advertising a shooting demonstration and competition to be held tomorrow at some place called Ace's Livery Stable. Hell, that's where I had my horses. I guessed I would look into it before I left town. The next morning, I got up soon enough to eat breakfast in the hotel's restaurant. I checked out and wandered down to the livery stable. A crowd had already started to collect, and I joined them. There were several wagons pushed together to form a sort of stage, and a man climbed up there just as I showed up. He gave a spiel about how he wanted to introduce the greatest shooter in the territory, Zachary Wade. After that, Wade put on a demonstration of shooting that certainly was better than the average man could do, but I could do most of his tricks by the time I was 7 years old. Pa had used those same tricks to teach me to shoot. The rest of the tricks I could do now. After the little exhibition, I discovered how the pair made their money. First, the master of ceremonies went through the crowd collecting 2 bits from everybody who had seen the show so far. I mentally shrugged my shoulders and tossed my 2 bits into the hat when he came by. That's when the show got down to the nitty-gritty. The MC challenged anybody in the audience to come up on stage and shoot in a contest against Wade. That invitation brought several volunteers. They put up $1 per shot to earn $1 per shot. Wade didn't always win, but he won most of the competitions. I didn't think that there was much of a contest here, but most of the crowd was enthralled. Then they upped the ante. The MC tossed clay targets into the air, and the contest was to see who could hit the most targets before they fell to the ground. I noticed that Wade had a passel of guns on stage, so that he never had to pause the show to reload. I thought that was a great idea. Anyway, as a demonstration, the MC threw 5 targets into the air, one at a time, and Wade shot every one of the targets. The target never broke in half, but was always shattered into a multitude of pieces. One of the fragments fell at my feet, and I picked it up to examine it. That's strange. The clay target was covered with little pit marks, and I had seen that the target was smooth when the MC gave it a toss. This aroused my interest, so I started following the action a bit more closely. I noticed that Wade was selecting his gun from a different rack from what he had been using. Aha! It dawned on me. The guns he was using now were loaded with birdshot instead of bullets. That way, his gun acted like a shotgun, and that made it a hell of a lot easier to shoot the clay targets. The bet now was $5 per bullet, but you could win $25 if you beat Wade. The contest went to another 5 targets if there was a tie. That was damned unlikely, with him using pellets instead of bullets. Now, my interest was truly aroused. I thought that I could beat him, even with his unfair advantage. When the number of volunteers slowed down, I stuck up my hand to volunteer. A kid's money was just as good as anybody else's, so they were happy for me to chip in. I laid my money on the counter and nodded to the MC. He tossed up a target and I shot at it with my Colt Navy. A hit. I managed to hit all 5, so now the pressure was on Wade. He felt the pressure, too, because he broke only 4 of the targets. I picked up my $25 and their $25. Hell, I could retire if we kept this up long enough. I stepped aside and reloaded while the next person tried his luck. He missed 1 and Wade hit all 5, so he lost his $25. I said that I wanted to try again, and they readily agreed. Again, I hit all 5, but so did Wade. We went again, and I again hit all 5. Unfortunately for him, Wade only hit 4. I won and picked up my $50. That was enough as far as I was concerned. I had proved my point to myself, and that was all I cared about. Nobody else wanted to shoot, so I had a few minutes to talk to Wade and the MC. Once nobody else was around, I told them that I knew how Wade could hit so many targets. Wade was embarrassed that he had been caught, but said, "When I start out the show, I can shoot nearly as well as you can, but my hand is tired by the time we get to the toss clay targets, so I need an edge. Don't worry, I won't tell on y'all. I was just having some fun at your expense. Good luck, and take care. Maybe I'll see y'all again one day." I collected my horses and packed my stuff. I did take time to eat dinner before I left. I wasn't sure where I was going next. It was getting to be late enough in the year to feel a little nip in the air at night, so I decided that it was time to head south before winter got here. I kept going until I got to Carlsbad. I was riding past the courthouse when I realized that I had not picked up any new wanted posters in a couple of months. I went in and took a full set of posters, since I wanted to see if I was still on the list. I hauled that stack of paper into the nearest saloon and sat down at an empty table with a Mexican beer. The first thing I did was to sort the posters into those with pictures and those without. I went through the stack of those without pictures and did not see one for me. Then I went through the stack with pictures and nearly fainted about halfway down. There was a drawing of my face. The reward was up to $100, but it was still for alive, only. Now, what the hell should I do? I guess that I was still on the run, but I had better be more careful now that the reward was up to $100. I had hoped to go home when winter came, but it looked like I had better skip that for now. Maybe I should head for California? No, I don't want to do that. I can see right now that I need a good lawyer that I can trust. Pa put a lot of store in Dominic Hayes back in Hobson, the first town the other way from Edgar Junction. Shit, I know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to visit Dominic Hayes. If I leave now, I will be traveling in the best weather until next spring. I'll start out tomorrow morning. You know how it is. Once an 11-year-old decides to do something, there's no holding him back. I'm afraid I pushed my horses pretty hard in getting to the town of Hobson, into the office of Dominic Hayes. No, I was not completely stupid. I rode up the alley behind his office and went in the back door. Mr. Hayes, it's Nathan Parker. Can I talk to you? Certainly, Nathan. Come on in. First, let me say that I sure was sorry about what happened to your pa. But I hear that your ma and the rest of the family are doing right well. What can I do for you? Thank you, Mr. Hayes. And thanks for the word on my folks. I came to you first because I don't want to cause them any trouble. You know that I am wanted by the federals for assault on a federal officer. I want to surrender and get that off my back. Will you take my case? Of all the stupid nonsense I have heard, that takes the cake. Certainly, I will take your case. I had no idea that those fools had gone that far. Please give me $1 to bind us together, and I will start right away to do what I can for you. That's fine with me. Here you are. Is it okay for me to visit my ma and the rest while I'm waiting for a trial? I've got an idea. You go out to your farm and get John or Benjamin to ride with you to the marshal's office at the jail in Edgar Junction. You surrender to him, and either John or Benjamin, whichever one comes with you, will get credit for the reward. That will really stick it to those fools who put up the reward. Meanwhile, I'll talk to the marshal and tell him what's going on. He'll get a laugh out of it, and he can release you to stay on your farm until the trial, if you promise to do that. Oh, that's a bully idea. I love it. Sure, I promise to stay at the farm as long as you tell me to. How much is this going to cost me? Right now, I have no idea. My bill will amount to $1, which you have already paid, but I may have to run up some expenses getting ready for the trial. I'll try to keep it down, though. Mr. Hayes, Pa was sure right about you. I appreciate this, and I'll do whatever you say I should do. That's good. The federal judge for this district is a smart and fair man, so I know that you will get a fair trial. I'll send word if you need to come back to my office before the trial. So go on to see your family. Good luck and good day to you. When I got home, everybody was glad to see me, of course, and I had a great time telling of my adventures in Mexico and NMT, New Mexico territory. They were surprised at how much money there was to be made in bounty hunting if you went about it the right way. I could see the glow in Benjamin's eyes when he heard about it. We laughed and said that Benjamin should be the one who turned me in, so he could rightfully claim to be a successful bounty hunter. The next day, Benjamin and I rode into Edgar Junction to visit the marshal. He fell out of his chair laughing when we told him why we were there. We went through all of the routine, including having me locked in a cell for a few minutes. I promised the marshal that I would stay at the farm until time for the trial, which should be about 3 weeks away. I rode home by myself while Benjamin rode to the county seat to collect the reward. He was home by noon the next day, so we all had another good laugh while we set the $100 aside to be used to pay for anything we needed for my trial. 3 weeks later, word came from Mr. Hayes for us to be at the county courthouse on Thursday for the trial. There were only 2 trials scheduled for that day, and mine was to be the first. Ma and Florence put on their best Sunday go-to-meeting dresses, and us boys dressed in our best clothes, too. The ladies rode in the buckboard, and us boys rode horses. Nobody with good sense ever went anywhere without arming himself, so I was wearing my guns just like everybody else. I did take my guns off when we got to the courthouse, though. It just seemed like the polite thing to do. We had dinner at the best, only, restaurant in town and hied ourselves to the courthouse for the trial. Mr. Hayes met us at the door and waited while I handed my guns to Benjamin. We shook hands and went inside, with John helping Ma, as was suitable since he was the senior man of the family. I had the honor of escorting Florence, who looked like the brightest ray of sunshine in the whole county. I got them seated on the front row of benches for the crowd, and I do mean crowd. There wasn't an empty seat by the time the judge was ready to start the trial. I was right proud to see how many supporters I had for the trial. The jury was selected without difficulty, and I sat at a table with Mr. Hayes. The bailiff called the court to order and introduced the judge. We then went through some preliminaries, and the real trial finally started. The prosecutor, who looked kind of embarrassed by the whole silly thing, called up a couple of witnesses to describe the duel. The prosecutor helped by asking the right questions, and they laid it on pretty thick. By the time they finished, there was no doubt that I had abided by all of the rules and laws, so it was a legitimate duel which I had won. However, that was not what the case was really about. There was no law against dueling with a federal officer, but there was a law against assaulting one. My accusation of him killing my pa was classed as an assault, as far as the law was concerned. Oh, I might be guilty of that. Mr. Hayes was very careful to establish the date of the killing, etc. Then he played his bombshell. He called in the clerk who had made out the paperwork making Oliver Carter a federal officer and had him testify to the date the appointment was made. That date was 2 weeks after the duel. The judge slammed his gavel down and declared that the charges must be dropped against me. Nearly everybody in the courtroom stood up and cheered, including the prosecutor, the jury, and the bailiff. The judge let the cheering run on for a couple of minutes before he started banging his gavel for order. The bailiff suddenly realized what was going on and helped to bring order. My back was really sore from all of the slaps of congratulations from my friends in the crowd. The judge declared a recess for 30 minutes, and he came down to shake my hand and to apologize for the travesty of justice this whole thing had been. Benjamin handed me back my guns, and I was soon properly dressed for all social occasions. Several of Oliver Carter's friends had attended the trial, but they stomped out once things calmed down a mite. We had decided that we needed a little more entertainment, so my family and I decided to stay for the other trial scheduled for that afternoon. This trial was a little bit different from mine. The defendant was accused of stealing an army payroll and murdering the clerk when he did it. This trial was pretty short, too. He was convicted of murder, which earned him 9 years in the federal penitentiary, and he was convicted of payroll theft, which was good for 37 years in jail. The sentences were to run sequentially. Well, 48 years in jail was tantamount to a death sentence, just long and drawn out. Nobody was surprised when the defendant started cursing the judge and the court, but we were all surprised when he grabbed the bailiff's gun and started shooting. He managed to kill the bailiff and give the judge a flesh wound before I was able to pull my cross-draw .44 and plug him in the right shoulder, smashing a lot of bone. He dropped the gun and collapsed on the floor. He now had his death sentence, since there was no way to treat that wound. I do want to say in my defense that I was delayed in drawing my pistol because I was leaning over in front of Ma to protect her from a stray bullet. We were a little slow to get away from the courtroom that day because of many questions I had to answer, including some for the local newspaper. The next day, the newspaper had a banner headline, "Local 11-year-old boy is hero of the day." I was proud of that, but I suspect that Ma was a little embarrassed by the publicity. Anyway, we went home and spent a very pleasant winter in each other's company. It was nice to be with my family, but I had gotten used to being on my own, so I did chafe a bit at having to follow someone else's orders. Oh, I could do it, but I didn't like it. One day, as spring was just starting, Ma said, "Nathan, I can see you're struggling to keep your temper in check and not take it out on the rest of us. If you need to be on your own for a while, we'll understand. In many ways, you're the most mature one in the house, even more than me. We want you to be happy, so if you want to leave, go ahead. We'll still love you, and you can visit whenever you want." Ma, I didn't know how to respond, but you've hit the nail on the head. I love all of you so much that I hate to leave, but I don't know what'll happen if I stay here much longer. It's especially hard with John bossing me around, even though he's 5 years older. Maybe I could go back to being a small-time bounty hunter and make do that way. Nathan, I understand exactly how you feel. I had the same problem with my older sister until I married your pa. Now, you go and take care of yourself. I have one last favor to ask. Benjamin's only a year older than you, so you two get along well. Do you think you could take him with you for a while, to see if he does better away from John's control? Sure, Ma. I'll take Benjamin if he wants to come. I won't boss him too much, but he'll have to follow my orders when I give them, at least until he learns how to handle things on his own. Well, Nathan, at 12, I think you're a man in every way. Just watch out for those saloon women. Now that you're growing up, I expect they'll be after you whenever they can. I'm not sure when that'll happen, Ma. I've never been with a woman, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. Oh, don't be silly. I know you boys watched your pa and me whenever you could. All you have to do is what we did. If the woman doesn't like it, she'll tell you what to change. You'll do fine. I have confidence in you. That was all of the birds and bees talk I ever got from Ma, but it turned out to be enough when the time came. Benjamin was all excited by the opportunity to join me in bounty hunting. I warned him that a screw-up could get us both killed, so he had to be on his toes. He got fitted out the same as me, with a .44 caliber Star DA in a cross-draw holster and a Colt Navy in a thigh holster. I wasn't worried about his shooting. Benjamin was nearly as fast as me, just not quite as accurate. Nevertheless, I was sure that he could hold his own in any kind of gunfight if he just didn't get overexcited. We decided to stay in Texas, now that I didn't have that stupid poster hanging over my head. It was still a little bit cool, so we decided to head down toward Laredo and swing north from there. I had found that the extra horses weren't really necessary, so we figured to try with just the horses we were riding. We'd stop at restaurants for meals and carry some bread and cheese in our saddlebags for lunch when we were caught out away from a town. We used the same caliber pistols and our Benjamin rifles used the same cartridges, so our ammunition supply wasn't much of a problem. I did wish that we could get 2 more of the Star DA pistols. That would make all of the pistols exactly the same, but that pistol was kind of rare. It seemed like Colt single action was the popular kind. Our Benjamins were .45 caliber centerfire, and I wondered if there was some way to convert the Star DAs to shoot that cartridge. Having metal cartridges all the same for all the guns was something nice to daydream about. I wondered if it would ever be possible. We stopped off at the first courthouse we came to restock our supply of wanted posters. We had a little trouble with the clerk. He didn't want to waste time dealing with kids. I had to find us a sympathetic judge to explain the facts of life to that self-important fool. Once the judge got through with him, I figured that clerk was going to be polite to everybody and do as he was asked. Anyway, we got our posters and left. I led Benjamin into the first saloon we came to where we could sit at a table and have a beer while we went through the stack of posters. I introduced Benjamin to Mexican beer, and he didn't like it at first. He complained that it didn't have as much taste to it as American beer. I told him to be patient. He would get to like it. We went through the posters and sorted them into the ones with and without pictures. The ones without pictures were pushed to the side while we went through the others. We'd gotten about halfway through the stack when I felt a slap on the back of my head. Now that wasn't polite anywhere, least of all in a saloon. I turned around and saw Galut standing behind me. Lord, did he look scruffy? Why did you hit me? I asked. Mostly 'cause I felt like it. What's a kid like you doing with a bunch of wanted posters, anyway? You think you're some sort of big bad bounty hunter? I turned my chair around so that I could face him without standing up. I figured to give him an unfounded sense of superiority. I answered, as a matter of fact, I am a successful bounty hunter. I'm known as the Texas Kid all over the New Mexico territory. Well, that did stretch the truth a little bit, but I had quickly developed a dislike for this bully. He guffawed and stepped back a pace or two. Well, Ifan Yuri's such a famous bounty hunter. Let me see you draw. Mister, if I draw, you are a dead man. Are you sure you still want me to draw? By this time, the whole saloon was quiet as they listened to the latest entertainment. The bully stared me in the eye for a few seconds, as if he was gauging his chances. Then, with no further warning, he shouted, "Draw." I drew my cross-draw pistol, which I'll bet he never looked at, and put a bullet through his chest. I hit him right over his heart, and he had to be dead by the time he fell to the floor. I did take the time to reload before holstering my pistol. One of the patrons came up to me and stuck out his hand. I'd like to shake the hand of the man who put that bully down. He's been asking to be killed for a couple of years, but none of us could get up the courage to try. The whole town is much obliged to ya. Let me buy you another beer, even if it's that expensive stuff. I readily agreed, and he bought one for Benjamin, too. I figured, what the hell, why not? And quickly thumbed through the posters to see if this Galut was on one. There he was. He was only worth $25, but that would certainly pay for the bullet and the beer. I tipped the swamper 2 bits, and he and Benjamin dragged the desperado to the sheriff's office where we got a receipt. I then went to the clerk who had been such a butt earlier and demanded the $25 reward. He got kind of snotty, but I showed him the poster and the receipt. He came through, but I threatened him with that judge again, and he straightened up some. I figured that he was really a lost cause. Benjamin was kind of excited by our adventure in that saloon. Is bounty hunting always that exciting? He asked. Actually, no. Mostly it's like everything else. There's some exciting times, there's some boring times, and there are a lot of times in between. I guess that the main thing about being a bounty hunter is keeping alert and keeping your wits about you. As long as you do that, you should be all right. How do you know where to go to find people? Mostly, I go into saloons and talk to bartenders and listen to the gossip. You can learn a lot of valuable things doing that. That's what we're going to do whenever we go into a saloon. If you go into a saloon just for a beer, you're wasting your time. While you are there, make a point to look around and to listen. You never know what you'll find out. One thing I found out from having Benjamin along. Traveling is a lot more pleasant when you have a companion. It's nice to be able to talk to somebody besides your horse. Horses ain't much for two-way conversation. Our stop for dinner was at one of those combination inns, saloons, restaurant, and general store to be found at most major crossroads. I noticed several horses hitched in front of the saloon, so I said to Benjamin that we ought to go in there first. These people might be interesting, and they might be gone before we finish eating. Inside the saloon, there were 3 men leaning against the bar and drinking beer. Sitting at a table were 4 men playing poker. The poker dealer was dressed like you would expect a professional gambler to dress. He had a fancy suit, was wearing a white shirt, and had a string tie. I looked closely at the poker players and at the 3 men at the bar. I pulled Benjamin's sleeve and got him to follow me into the restaurant. As soon as we were in the restaurant, he said, "What do we do, Nathan? Every one of those galoots, but for the gambler, are on our posters." "Yeah, I know. We need to plan this out. 6 men are too many to brace in a place like this." In a situation like this, I try to think what Pa would do. Unless you got a better idea, I think that we should follow them and see where they spend the night. Maybe we can come up with something then. I sure don't want to ignore them. That's $350 standing in there. How does that sound to you? It sounds fine with me. I'll just do whatever you tell me to do. We had finished our dinner and had just paid the outlandish 50 cents each for it when we heard a couple of gunshots. Benjamin jumped up and started to run into the saloon. I grabbed his arm and said, "Hold on. You don't want to run into a bullet not even intended for you. Let's check it out without getting ourselves shot at." We cautiously moved up to the door leading into the saloon and carefully looked around the edge of the door. "Gil, why did you shoot that tin horn?" "'Cause the scumsucker was cheating me." "Okay, that I can understand. Get your money and let's get out of here." I said to Benjamin, "You stay here and cover this door. I'm heading for the front door. We may have a quick change of plans, so be alert." I ran to the front door of the saloon and kneeled down so that I could see under the butterfly doors. The bartender stooped down and came back up with a shotgun. He didn't even get fully straightened up before he was hit by bullets from the guns of the men standing at the bar. With that many bullets from that close range, the bartender had to be dead. The crooks started walking toward the front door, and I let them get close enough to be clear shots for Benjamin. I hoped he had his star DA drawn because I could see a need for a lot of fast shooting. Once the crooks reached the position I wanted, I shouted, "Stop, all of you. Y'all are under arrest. Drop your guns and raise your hands." I never expected them to give up like that, so I had my gun out and I was ready to shoot. As expected, my command produced a hail of bullets aimed at the front door. The butterfly doors were shattered. Why did they think that I would be so stupid as to be standing up there? I returned their fire, and Benjamin started shooting as soon as I did. 4 of the crooks fell dead or dying, but 2 of the men jumped behind some tables they tipped over. I had fired 4 times, and I thought that Benjamin had done the same. I couldn't worry too much about Benjamin. I just hoped he followed Pa's advice. I took out my Colt and laid it where I could grab it at need. While there was a pause in the action, I took the time to reload. I was using paper cartridges, so it took less than a minute to reload 4 chambers. Then I remembered Pa's admonition to take every advantage that you might have, so I went ahead and loaded the last chamber so that I would have a true 6-shooter. I holstered my star and added to the load in my Colt. I now had 12 shots, instead of the conventional 10 shots. That might turn to my advantage. Hopefully, Benjamin had done the same thing. Still holding my Colt, I dodged inside the saloon and ran to a table which I turned over to act as a shield. The likelihood of a ball penetrating a tabletop was too small to worry about. That's why I had run into the saloon, because I was never going to be able to shoot through the tabletop. I looked over at the other door and saw Benjamin following my lead by creeping on the floor toward a table. He got there and tipped it over before he was spotted. I'll bet the crooks didn't even know that he was there until he tipped over the table. I yelled at Benjamin, "Benjamin, you cover that side of the room." "I've got this side." The answer came back, "Got it." I needed to change position to get a more flanking shot at the 2 crooks. There was no safe way to run from table to table, but the tabletops were round, so, with a little care, I could roll the table as I moved. I started to move, and that produced a rain of bullets against the tabletop. I didn't know what the crooks thought they were doing, but there was no chance of them hurting me, as careful as I was being. Apparently, the crooks figured out what I was trying to do, so they backed up into a corner near one end of the bar. I yelled at Benjamin, "Keep them away from the bar." As soon as I said that, Benjamin started to roll his table toward the other end of the bar. He had a lot less distance to go, so he was able to scoot behind the bar before the crooks were able to. Shit, this standoff could last forever at the rate we were going. I needed something that could penetrate the tabletop. Then it occurred to me that the Benjamin rifle bullet could probably do that. I yelled at Benjamin, "Keep them busy for a minute." Without waiting for a reply, I ducked out of the saloon and ran to our horses. I grabbed both rifles and the spare ammunition and ran back to my table in the saloon. I was gone less than 90 seconds and nothing had changed. I made sure that both rifles were fully loaded and started shooting one of them at the overturned tables as fast as I could lever in the next round, aim, and shoot. I heard a cry of pain somewhere during that fusillade, but I didn't pay much attention. I was trying to make a point. By the time the last bullet had been fired, the rifle was so hot that I could not hold it. I picked up the other rifle and did the same shooting routine at the other table. Again, there was a cry of pain, but I didn't know what that signified. I emptied the rifle, which was also now too hot to hold. I picked up the first rifle and reloaded it. By that time, the second rifle had cooled enough that I could reload it, though the rifle was still too hot to hold to shoot. While all of this shooting was going on, Benjamin had taken the time to reload his pistols, so he was ready for my next order. I picked up the first rifle that was now cool enough to handle and repeated my shooting campaign at the first table. I tried to spread the shots around so that I would hit anybody behind the table, no matter where he was hiding. There were no cries of pain this time, so I assumed that the person behind that table was dead or unconscious. I used the other rifle to rerun the attack on the second table. This time I got a screech of pain, but I kept shooting until this rifle was empty. Benjamin, stay behind the bar, but see if you can get a look at those two galoots. I waited a few minutes, and then Benjamin stood up. When he did that, I stood up and walked over to the tables. There was a lot of blood spattered all over the place. Both of the crooks were most certainly dead. It looked like the Benjamin rifles did the job we needed. More than ever, I wanted to get those cartridges into a pistol. I had Benjamin go over these two, while I looted the bodies of the other 4 crooks. We added it up later, but we got a total of $195 in gold and silver plus pistols and knives. We dragged the crooks out to their horses and tied them across the saddles. Finally, I remembered the people in the restaurant, so I stuck my head through the door and told them that the war was over. I did tell them that the bartender and the gambler were also dead. We looked over what we could find on the horses. It was almost a gold mine with 6 Benjamin rifles in good condition. We took all of the ammunition for the Benjamins, but left everything else on the horses. The waiter in the restaurant said that the nearest town was 6 miles down the road toward Laredo, so that was the way we went. When we got there, we caused quite a stir with our parade of 6 horses carrying 6 bodies. The marshal gave us our 6 receipts, but he refused to pay for burying the bodies. That's okay. We took the bodies to the local undertaker and negotiated a bulk rate. He charged us $2.50 for the burials. I thought that was reasonable for 6 bodies, so I didn't try to haggle him down below that. Once we got rid of the bodies, we went around to a livery stable and sold the horses, tack, and other stuff. We got $137 for the lot, so I was happy. Benjamin thought that we should have gotten more, so I offered to let him negotiate the next time. He was thrilled at the opportunity. I got directions to the nearest courthouse where we could redeem our receipts. It was late enough in the day that we decided to take a room in the hotel and wait until tomorrow to continue our journey. Benjamin could hardly wait to eat supper and go by a saloon to celebrate our good fortune. We had split everything evenly, so we each had nearly $250 from this one day of work. Here's where we ran into our first problem. Benjamin fancied himself a good poker player. He insisted that we find a saloon with a poker game, so I went along with him. Shit, he took less than 2 hours to run through his entire income for the day. He even had the nerve to try to borrow some money from me, but I refused. I told Benjamin that I wanted nothing to do with his gambling, but I insisted that he had to pay for half the living expenses. He pouted a little while, then agreed to let me handle all of the expenses. He was to pay me $60 a month toward his share of the living expenses, and he was free to gamble away the rest of his money. I hoped that he would learn that he could not beat a professional poker player. As far as I know, Benjamin never did learn any better. We went along for 5 months, making about $250 to $300 per month, which we split 50 to 50. At the end of this time, I had close to $700 as my share of the bounty income, plus about $90 for expenses. As was usual, we had rented one hotel room which we shared for the night. We spent some time visiting saloons looking for leads on wanted men. Actually, I did the looking and Benjamin kept after me to lend him some money so that he could join a poker game. I refused a few times, and Benjamin quit asking after a while. I thought that was the end of it. When I woke up the next morning, Benjamin was gone. His clothes and guns were gone too. I couldn't figure it out, but I needed to hurry if I was going to be in time for breakfast, so I didn't worry about it. I never leave any money in the hotel room, so I picked up my money belt and was shocked to find that it was empty. I looked all over the room, but there was not a penny lying around anywhere. Not only all of the bounty money, but all of the expense money was gone too. Shit, Benjamin must have taken it. Well, I still had some money so that I could eat. I kept a double eagle in each of my boots so that I would have some money even if I was robbed. I took those 2 coins out of their hiding places, which I had never mentioned to Benjamin. I went to breakfast, since I had to eat. I checked out of the hotel and went to the livery stable to pick up my horse. I have to admit that I was worried, but Benjamin did leave me my horse and tack. I paid my bill and rode out of town. I couldn't bring myself to search for Benjamin. From the way he treated me, I wanted nothing more to do with him. I hoped he managed to get by, but I figured that he was in serious trouble. I never heard of a gambling addiction, but I figured that Benjamin must have something like that. Well, we all have our faults, but what could I do? I continued to work by myself, more because I needed the money than because my heart was really in it. I stayed on the job until the weather started to cool off and managed to build up a small cash that would get me started next year. I decided that enough was enough and headed home. I didn't know what I was going to say to Ma. I guess that I had to tell her the truth. This was anything but a happy homecoming, since everybody wanted to know what had happened to Benjamin. That evening, I called them all together and told them what had happened between Benjamin and me. I really felt bad about it, but so did everybody else. Ma tried to cheer me up, telling me it was not my fault. I could see that she was blaming herself for sending Benjamin out while he was still a child. I guess I put my foot in it when I commented that Benjamin was older than me. Ma ran from the room, crying, and Florence ran to try to comfort her. John said he knew about Benjamin's weakness, but he had no idea that it was so strong. Anyway, we managed to get through the winter, but I was glad when spring came along and I could leave. All of us hoped that Benjamin would come home, but he never did. We never found out what happened to him. I didn't say anything, but I figured that he had been shot over accusations of cheating in a poker game. What really bothered me was that I feared that Benjamin had been the one doing the cheating. I left, heading in the general direction of Amarillo. Why? I have no idea, except that I had never been up that way before. I picked up a new set of posters before I left, so I was prepared for whatever fate might have in store for me. I did notice one thing. I really missed having a partner. I did not notice it so much last year because I kept secretly hoping that Benjamin would come back. I had no idea how to go about finding a partner. I just had to trust to luck, which had mostly been good to me through the years. I was riding along minding my own business when I heard gunfire up ahead. I sped up to check it out. I couldn't help commenting to myself how many times this sort of thing seems to happen to me. Here I was, 13 years old in the spring of 1873, and I was already ruminating over the past. You'd think that I was getting old. I came around the bend in the road and saw a man lying behind his dead horse. Judging from the powder smoke, he was fighting 3 men about 60 yards away, up the road on one side. When I got close enough, I yelled, "What's going on? I'm a bounty hunter. I was ambushed by those 3 galoots up there. Help me on, I'll split the reward with ya." "Okay, just don't shoot me by mistake." I knew the crooks heard us yelling to each other, so my appearance would be no surprise. I decided that the smart thing would be for me to get behind them. As soon as I turned off the road, I saw why they had not flanked the bounty hunter. The ground along here was so broken and rough, no horse could safely get through. I dismounted and pulled my Benjamin rifle from its scabbard. I loaded my pockets with spare ammunition and started making my way on foot toward the crooks. It took me over 20 minutes to move 100 yards, but I finally did it. I got into position and lined up on the 3 galoots I could see. The fools were passing around a bottle of liquor and swigging every time the bottle got to them. I swear, how dumb can you get? I was only 30 or so yards away, so I figured I could handle 3 drunks pretty easily. I began shooting and, by my 3rd shot at that range, I had wounded or killed all 3. I waved my hat in the air and yelled, "It's all clear. Come on up." The bounty hunter came up the road and climbed to where the 3 now dead galoots were lying. He waved to me, and I went down to his position. "Howdy, I'm Nathan Parker. I call myself the Texas Kid. Who might you be?" "Well, I might be the governor of Texas, but I ain't. I'm Jeff Taylor, and I'm much obliged for your help. You just earned yourself $500 and my gratitude. These 3 are wanted for bank robbery. The total reward for them is $1,000, so I figured you ought to get half of that. Just help me haul them to the nearest town with a marshal, and we can go collect our money." "That sounds mighty good to me. I guess all we need to do is to find their horses so you'll have something to ride." It only took a few minutes to find their horses, so we were ready to leave in about an hour. It was kind of a juggling act to get them onto 2 horses along with the tack and other stuff from Jeff's horse, but we finally made it. Looting the men was right profitable, too. There was nearly $100 in cash, but a more useful item for me was another Star .44 caliber pistol. I swapped my share of the cash for the pistol. I had high hopes for it. Once we collected our money from the county clerk, Jeff and I adjourned to a saloon for a beer. I told him that I, too, was a bounty hunter and was looking for a partner. I told him some of my experiences with Benjamin without telling the whole story, and he could see the value of working as partners. Today having been a good example, Jeff suggested that we join up on a trial basis to see how it worked out. Jeff was 19 years old, so there wasn't too much difference in our ages for us to be friends. One thing I liked about him was that he did not care for gambling any more than I did. I told him that I had been headed for Amarillo, and his response was, "Why not?" On the way, I explained that my quarry had been the low end of the pay scale because they were so easy to find. I said that it had been my experience that we could each make a steady $1,100 to $1,500 a year. That wouldn't make us rich, exactly, but it was plenty for me. He agreed that I had a point. I have a weakness, I admit it. Every time I go into a town with a gunsmith, I just have to stop and look over the wares. I almost never buy anything except ammunition, but I do like to talk to the gunsmith to hear what are the latest developments in a critical tool of my trade. The gunsmith in Amarillo was a revelation. He showed me a couple of items new to me, the Winchester 1873 model in .44-40 caliber and a companion Smith & Wesson top break pistol, also in .44-40 caliber. The only thing that kept me from buying both on the spot was that the pistol was single action, and I still preferred my double action star. Further conversation revealed that the S&W pistol could be converted to double action, provided only that I was willing to spend about $100 for the conversion. The gunsmith said that there would be considerable handwork involved, so it would take him around 3 months to complete the conversion. Shit. My mouth was watering to have such a toy, so I contracted on the spot to have him convert one of his stock S&W pistols for me. I told him that if the action was as smooth as with my Star DA, I would buy 4 more from him, for a total of 5. Now, his mouth started to water. He had never made such a sale before. He assured me that he could do the job. I wanted 2 such pistols for me, 2 for Jeff, and 1 as a Christmas present for my brother John. I was certain that Jeff would convert as soon as he had a chance to try out the wonderful speed of double action and of reloading with cartridges in a top break pistol. I immediately traded in my Benjamin for the .44-40 Winchester and left a $250 deposit for the 5 pistols. I promised to be back in 3 months for my wonders. I didn't know how the gunsmith felt, but I was walking on clouds just thinking about my discovery. Jeff was impressed with the Winchester, and he was interested in a new rifle, since his Benjamin was showing signs of wear and tear. The combination of my enthusiasm and his real need convinced him to buy one of the new Winchesters. I was still so excited that when we went back to the gunsmith for Jeff's new rifle, I swapped one of my Star DAs and $10 for a S&W .44-40 pistol. The new pistol was a good enough fit in the old holster that I didn't even need to make that change. I really got carried away and bought a bullet pouch for my belt to hold the spare .44-40 cartridges. I was going through money like it was water, but I had no other place that I wanted to spend it. So why not have some fun with it? Of course, Amarillo, itself, was no place for a couple of low-end bounty hunters like us since there was too much of a chance of walking into a bullet if we let ourselves be known. Therefore, we headed north toward the Oklahoma Panhandle after we had restocked our pile of wanted posters. We quickly found some wanted men as we moved north, and we were each about $100 richer when we came to the last town in Texas. Now we had to make a choice. We could push on farther north into Oklahoma, or we could turn west into NMT. I had automatically selected NMT, mostly because I had already been there once before, so I felt more comfortable there. However, Jeff suggested that we head into Oklahoma, since neither one of us had ever been there, and there were rumors that Oklahoma was a hotbed of potential bounty. Jeff didn't have to work very hard to convince me, so we headed north. The border was not well defined, so it was impossible to tell when we actually crossed over, but we found out where we were when we wandered into a town named Oxala. There was a sign which proudly proclaimed that we had entered Oxala, Oklahoma territory. It looked like any other town to me, but I agreed to take their word for it. One thing could be said for Oxala: it was full of saloons. We arbitrarily picked the first one we came to, tied up to the hitching rail, and went inside. The contrast of the bright sun outside to the deep gloom inside made us absolutely blind for a few seconds, and that was almost a fatal delay. A voice shouted, "Jeff Taylor, I've got YA now. Why scumsucker?" Neither one of us had completely recovered from the change in light level, so we did the best thing we could. We both dove for the floor as bullets whizzed over our heads. I swear, nothing clears your vision like being shot at. I rolled to the left, and Jeff rolled to the right. Our idea was to force the shooter to divide his attention while we took the time to identify him and to pull our guns. He was standing toward the end of the room, more to my side than to Jeff's. I showed the advantage of the cross-draw holster again as I got my pistol out and aimed before I had stopped rolling. Remembering Pa's advice, I fired as quickly as I could draw a bead on his chest. That was the end of the shooting from his side of the contest. That .44-40 bullet really packed a punch and seemed more accurate than the round ball. The latter may have been imagination, but whatever it was, I hit exactly where I had aimed. My bullet caved in his breastbone, and something seemed to penetrate his heart because he fell without even a groan. Jeff and I carefully surveyed the rest of the barroom, but all we could see was a few customers cowering on the floor. We got up and went to see who it was who had welcomed us to Outlaw with such enthusiasm. Jeff said, "Well, I'll be goddamned. That's Harold Jenkins. I heard that he escaped prison about 6 weeks ago and had headed north. That scumsucker is worth $350, so we've paid for our trip already. We found $4.53 and a worn Colt Navy, so there wasn't much there, but we didn't mind. His horse was tied outside near ours, so we tied him across the saddle and headed back to Texas to collect our bounty. We collected our money and retired to a saloon to consider our next move. Since we were back in Texas, our choices were pretty much what they had been before we entered Outlaw. With the optimism of youth, we decided to head back to Oklahoma. We figured that we had about a month of free time earned from Harold Jenkins, so we could go that long without another capture and still be ahead of the game. So it was back to Oklahoma, but we figured to avoid Outlaw, since our cover had been blown there. We headed a bit east of our original route, and it took an extra day to find another town. We visited 5 saloons, but didn't find anything, so we moved on. 2 more towns were also empty of useful prey, so we kept moving eastward. We were riding along between towns when we were approached by galloping horses. 4 white men rode up to us and asked, "Have you seen a lone Chickasaw riding through here? The scumsucker stole a horse from me, and I want it back." We said that we had not seen any Indians at all. In fact, we were new to the territory and would not recognize a Chickasaw if we saw one. They rode off like split, and we never saw them again. We were not in the horse-chasing business, so we promptly forgot the incident. We came to a town a couple of hours later and went to the most convenient saloon. We had seen several Indians in town, so I asked the bartender about them. "That's some Cherokees what come into town to trade. They never stay long, and they never come into the saloons. We're close enough to the organized Indian territories that they are regular customers." We went through the saloons in town, but didn't find anything useful, so we left, headed west this time. Our route coming in had been sort of southerly, so we stuck to the northern border this time. Hell, there weren't enough towns on this side of the neutral strip, as the Panhandle was correctly called, to make a pinch of difference, so we turned back toward Texas. Besides, we had been away from Amarillo for almost 3 months, so I wanted to head back to see how much progress the gunsmith had made. We rode into Amarillo exactly 3 months to the day since I had placed my order, so I was anxious to go by the gunsmith the very first thing. The shop was open, so my first worry was assuaged. The gunsmith greeted me by name and said, "Your timing is perfect." I was headed out to the range to make a final check on the guns. "You can be the first to fire the fully complete model. I have dry-fired here in the shop, but I've shot no bullets yet." Jeff and I went out to the alley behind the shop, and the gunsmith strung up his rope warning barriers so that nobody would walk into a stray bullet. We were shooting into an adobe wall about 20 yards away, which was perfect for testing the accuracy of the pistols. The gunsmith handed me an empty pistol, broken open, and ready to be loaded. I loaded all 6 chambers and fired as fast as I could pull the trigger until all 6 bullets had been expended. Perfect. This gunsmith was a genius. The action was even smoother than with the Star D Ace, and I really liked the balance. My shots were somewhat scattered, as one would expect at that speed and range, so I reloaded, saving the brass as the gunsmith had requested. This time, I fired 6 shots in single action, aiming carefully for each shot, and using both hands to steady my aim. I was quite satisfied with a cluster of bullet holes just over 4 inches in diameter. That was excellent until I had a chance to become more familiar with the gun. I handed the pistol to Jeff and had him go through the same routine that I had. He was absolutely delighted with the feel of the gun in both double and single action. We fired all 5 of the guns in every combination of action, stance, and rate of fire that we could think of and concluded that we had as near to perfection as one was likely to find in a revolver. Once Jeff was hooked on the guns, I presented 2 to him as presents. He was stunned. I bought a presentation case for the 5th gun to use when I gave it to my brother. I asked about converting the Star D Ace to use .44-40 cartridges, and the gunsmith said that he could do that in about a week. I emptied my 2 Star D Ace and left them with him for conversion. Jeff and I spent a week in Amarillo just relaxing and investigating the wonders of a big city. My guess was that Amarillo had a population at that time of over 500 people, and I was astounded that a city could be so large. Not only was the city full of saloons, but they had several brothels. Jeff decided that this was a good opportunity for me to learn what sex was all about from the personal side. I can't say that I was enthusiastic, but I wasn't reluctant either. I just didn't know what to expect. Of course, by now, I had discovered the pleasure that my hand could give me, but it didn't have any real idea of what to expect from a real live woman. Jeff was convinced that it was time for me to find out. He asked around, explaining the situation, and received recommendations for several of the better establishments in town. One, in particular, was highly recommended. So Jeff took me there on our 4th day in Amarillo. He left me in a bit of an uncomfortable situation to speak with several of the women while he went to talk to the manager. The women were playfully teasing me, making me feel awkward. Jeff and the manager returned shortly, and she directed one of the more experienced women to take me to her room to teach me about relationships and how people can share joy and intimacy with one another. Well, let me tell you, that was quite an experience. It took all night, and I was exhausted the next morning. I figured I needed at least a week of rest to recover my strength. I ached in places I didn't even know I had. That woman, though I won't describe her negatively, taught me so much that I was sure I'd never need to use it all. I felt confident that my future partner would be in for something special. I learned that I could use my hands, my lips, and my skills to bring someone joy, if they would only give me the chance. The woman said I was a very quick learner, and she seemed to enjoy every moment of our time together. I felt flattered by her praise. The Star DAs were as good as the gunsmith had promised. He had reworked the loading lever to be an empty shell ejector, so nothing was wasted. It still took much longer to reload these pistols than it did the S&WS, but they made excellent backup weapons. I had a special holster made to let me hide the modified Star in my boot, and the other one was carried in a saddlebag. I was now carrying a total of 15 rounds in conveniently reachable holsters, so I felt well prepared for any situation. I still carried my Bowie knife and my Arkansas frog sticker for those rare occasions when a gun wasn't appropriate. Jeff and I decided to swing south, now that it was beginning to cool off for winter. Actually, it was not the temperature so much as the wind that pushed me south. I got tired of that cutting wind real fast. I wanted to head home, and Jeff had no other place to go, so I invited him to spend the winter at our farm. He was reluctant to commit for more than a few days, but all I needed was an opening. On the way south, we encountered a fool in a saloon who was sure that he could take on both of us, especially since we were kids. He drew on us, and we both got off a shot before his revolver even cleared leather. He was worth $65, and we didn't have to tote him far to find the marshal's office. We collected our money and were on our way in short order. Our next catch was at one of those combination places at a crossroads. We had stopped off for lunch and had just started on our beef and beans when 3 men came stomping into the restaurant. Jeff and I recognized them as wanted bank robbers to the tune of $550 for the 3 of them. Several other people, including 2 women, were in the restaurant, so we held off. We didn't want innocent people to be hurt, especially women. We ate slowly, hoping that the 3 would finish before us, but they seemed to be in no great hurry, either. Finally, we could not stall any longer, so we paid our bill, another one of those outrageous 50-centers. We went out on the veranda to wait for them to come out. Jeff smoked a cigar, but I had not acquired the habit, yet. It took those 3 crooks a hell of a long time to eat, but they eventually showed up. We let them get to their horses and start to mount before Jeff said, "Y'all are under arrest FER bank robbery. Stay where y'all are, and we won't shoot." Now, we knew that they were not going to do like Jeff said, so we were prepared with our guns drawn. Maybe I'll understand when I get older, but those fools went for their guns, even though we had them covered. Whatever the reason was for them trying to draw, they never got very far. One might have survived if he had dropped to the ground under his horse before he tried to draw, but that didn't happen. Jeff and I opened up and had killed all 3 of the bank robbers before we emptied our guns. I had fired 4 shots and Jeff had fired 3, so the robbers were well and truly dead. The horses were more upset by the smell of blood than they were by the sound of the gunshots, but they didn't do more than move around a little, even though they were no longer hitched to the rail. People came pouring out onto the veranda, stupid as that sounds, but went back inside as soon as they saw that the excitement was over. Jeff and I went through the pockets, etc., of the crooks and found a few dollars, but we were stunned when we looked through the saddlebags and found $7,065 in gold coins and bars. Shit, this must be loot from 1 or more bank robberies. What were we going to do with it? We didn't make a lot of noise about it until we were well away from the building. We stopped and discussed how to handle the discovery. Neither one of us knew where the money had come from, nor how many banks had been involved. We wondered if we should turn it in somewhere or keep it as spoils of war just like any other gold we would find on somebody we shot. This was a conundrum that we could not answer for now. We divided the money between us to get it out of the crook's saddlebags before we sold the tack. We decided to postpone any decision for now and just go along as if we had not found it. I decided that I would ask my lawyer friend, Dominic Hayes, for his advice. The crooks were turned in, and we collected our bounty. We were now filthy rich, at least until we decided what to do with the bank loot. We felt that we needed to make a decision pretty damned soon, so we hurried home. I had asked Jeff not to say anything about the loot until after we had talked to Dominic Hayes. He agreed. So there was a lot of good feeling as he met the family, and I got hugs and kisses from everybody. I noticed that there was a spark jumping between Jeff and Florence. Aha. Was there something here? We didn't have a spare room, so Jeff slept in my bed with me, but that was no problem. We often did that in hotels on the road. I waited a couple of days and then said that Jeff and I needed to visit my lawyer. This raised a few eyebrows, but no great questions. Jeff and I rode to Hobson to see the lawyer. We had to wait a few minutes because Dominic was talking to another client. When they finished, Dominic came out and greeted me warmly. I introduced him to Jeff and explained that we needed some advice. We went into Dominic's office, and I explained the situation. I told him that we were simply holding the loot right now, while we were trying to come to a decision about what to do with the money. I said that as far as we could see, our choices were to keep the money, just as we would with any other money we found on somebody that we killed in the line of duty, or to turn the money in as a special case. However, we simply had no idea where to turn the money in, if we decided to go that way. Dominic said, "Gentlemen, first of all, let me congratulate y'all for having a sense of ethics. Most people would just keep the money, not say anything to anybody. I can't speak directly to your consciences, but I don't think that I have ta. I seems to me that the best legal advice I can give ya is to consider the money as found treasure. If ya had found the money in some cave, there would be no question of it belonging to y'all. Therefore, I think that y'all can keep the money with a perfectly clear conscience. Now, y'all can go do anything you like with the money. My advice is to have fun. Now, I'm gonna charge y'all a $5 consultation fee. I can't work for free, you know." The last was said with a smile. We thanked Dominic for his advice, and I dropped a half-eagle on his desk. We shook hands and went home. Man, that was a relief. Now I could tell Ma and John that we were rich. I'd leave it up to them to figure out what we would do with all that money. When we got home, I called everybody together and told them about the money. They were flabbergasted. None of us had ever seen that much money before, and they were doubly shocked when I told them that I was leaving it up to them to figure out what to do with the money. I pulled out the saddlebag and dumped my share of the money on the table. That was a hell of a pile of gold. I couldn't help being a little bit amused. Florence was just this side of fainting. I asked Ma what she would like to do with the money. She thought for a minute and said, "I sure would like a bigger house." This was as big as Pa could afford when we built it, but I think that now we can afford to add on a couple of rooms. I asked John what he wanted to do. He said that he didn't know for sure, but he was kind of sweet on Simmons. Now that they had a little money ahead, he would like to ask her to marry him. Everybody in the family, including Jeff, cheered at that. We hugged him and patted him on the back. He grinned at that encouragement and said that he might just visit the Simmons this afternoon. Jeff and Florence had been thicker than thieves this past winter. I swear, if there had been any place to go that was private, she would probably have talked him into taking her virginity. Florence was now 18 years old, so she was past the normal marrying age, but she had to be a prime catch. If Jeff came back to spend next winter here, I would bet all I owned that they would be married within a month. The timing would just depend on when the preacher was in town. Florence wouldn't want to wait, but I was sure that Ma would. Pa had a strong box that we used for the family money. I just dumped my gold loose in the box, but we insisted that Jeff put his in a sack if he was going to store his there. I think Florence looked on that strong box as a kind of hope chest. With all his gold in that box, she was sure that Jeff would be back next winter. Ma had spent all winter planning what additions she wanted to put on the house, so she would be ready to start on it as soon as summer came. Every day that he could get there, John had been over to visit the Simmons. Those two lovebirds were as good as married. All they needed was the preacher, and he was due in next week. They had pushed up the wedding date so that Jeff and I could attend before we left on our hunt for the bad guys. One reason that Ma had rushed on making the expansion plans was so that she could accommodate John and Anne. John had explained the situation to Anne, and she had agreed to move into Ma's house, and understood that a new wing was planned for the house, and that would belong to her and John. The same was planned for Florence and Jeff when they tied the knot. Ma wanted us to stay as one big extended family. It was 1874 and I was now 14, no longer a kid by any stretch of the definition under Texas custom. I could even get married if I wanted to, but I wasn't even thinking of that right now. I was just in a hurry to move on to my favorite pastime, bounty hunting. Jeff and I discussed our options and concluded that we would give NMT a try. We headed for Carlsbad to pick up a supply of NMT wanted posters. I figured that we could go from there to Las Cruces and then on to Lord's Book. From there, we would figure out what to do. From our current perspective, it looked like there was no point in going on into Arizona territory, since we would pretty soon run into bare desert. Neither one of us was interested in fighting with the desert. We left for Carlsbad as soon as we could after the wedding, which was attended by a fantastic number of people. I'll bet there were over 100 there. There were so many that the wedding was held outdoors because not all of the guests could fit into the church. A grand time was held by all. There was even a chivalry, complete with the tossing out of the bloody sheet. John had gotten word of the planned chivalry, so he had secreted a chicken in the room, just in case. I saw the live chicken the next morning when it was released, so there was no trickery involved. Jeff and I had barely crossed over into NMT when we saw a plume of smoke on the horizon. We rushed as fast as our horses could manage to reach what we were sure had to be a burning homestead. Unfortunately, we were correct. We got there in time to see 11 Indians assaulting to death a woman. A man was already dead, having been horribly tortured. 2 girls were being held to one side, obviously in wait until their captors were finished with the woman. The girls were tied to a wagon wheel in such a way that they were forced to watch the treatment of their parents. The first thing we noted about the Indians was that there were no horses in evidence. That meant that the Indians were either Apaches or Navajos. Neither one were somebody to be messed with, but we had to rescue the girls. We used the Comanche trick, which never seemed to work for them, but that was because they used it in the wrong way. We charged our horses right through the bunch of Indians around the woman. We were not afraid of hurting her. For practical purposes, she was already dead. We did not shoot until we got very close to the Indians. At that point, we could not miss, and we put 10 bullets into the gang, killing any Indian we found standing. I am happy to say that the Indians had no chance to withstand our charge. We were to them and threw them almost before they knew that we were there. Very few Indians needed a second bullet, but I was prepared to run at them for all of the times necessary to eliminate them. I believe that there is a difference between simple barbarism and outright savage meanness, and this was not barbarism that we saw today. When the last Indian was dead, we made sure that there was nothing that we could do for the woman. She was already dead. We turned our attention to the girls. As it happened, Jeff went to the younger one, about 6 years old, and I went to the older one, about 14 years old, my age. Both girls were naked and scratched and bruised, but otherwise physically unharmed. We found blankets to use to wrap the girls and hauled them away from the scene of all that horror as soon as we could. We took them to a grove of trees about 100 yards away and left them with water and food while we buried their parents. The Indians had made an absolute mess of everything. We could not find anything worth salvaging. We couldn't even find any clothes for the girls to wear. In desperation, we dressed them in our spare pants and shirts, but we had no shoes that they could wear. The younger girl was in borderline hysterics, but I managed to get some information from her sister. I did not ask anything about the raid. They had thought enough about that for now. Instead, I asked if they had any relatives in the area who could take them in. The answer was that there was nobody who they could ask to shelter them, so we had only one choice. Of course, we could have abandoned them to their fate, but neither one of us could do that. Our only option seemed to be to take care of them ourselves. Well, nothing else for it. We immediately took them on our horses and headed home with them. Ma would be glad to take care of them, especially now that they would not be a financial burden. Rose of Sharon, which we shortened to Rose, was the younger one, and she rode with Jeff. Audrey, the older one, rode with me. In fact, there seemed to be no real choice. Audrey would not let me out of her sight, literally. She even followed me when I relieved myself, and she insisted that I do the same for her. Audrey was a very frightened and disturbed girl. Modesty simply disappeared from her vocabulary. My clothes fit Audrey well enough, but we had to stop and buy some clothes for Rose. Because she was going to have to straddle a horse, we just bought boys' pants for her and didn't worry about it. We had to ride slowly because of the way the girls had to sit on the horses, so it took us several weeks to get home. I was right about finding a home for the girls with us. Ma took to Audrey and Rose right off, and they were part of the family almost before they got both feet on the ground. Jeff and I hung around for a week, getting the girls used to the idea of them staying with Ma while we were gone on our work. The girls could understand having to work, so that was enough to break the emotional hold on us. When we left, the girls kissed us goodbye. We reached Carlsbad without incident and picked up the wanted posters. I no longer looked so young, so I did not attract attention for that reason. My voice had deepened, so that was no problem either. We spent a day in Carlsbad, but did not find any action. We left for Las Cruces without delay. Las Cruces was a bit more interesting. We found 2 men that we arrested. Interestingly enough, neither one wanted to fight, so we didn't have to kill anybody. Actually, I was glad, because I was no longer so anxious to prove that I was as good as the next man. These two brought us $55, so we were off to a good start. There was nothing else for us in Las Cruces, so we headed west. There were so few towns through here that it looked like we had made a mistake. We were saved from a complete fiasco by a small band of Mexicans who were holding up a stage as we caught sight of them. There were 7 Mexicans standing around a coach with their guns drawn. This did not look like a good place to try another cavalry charge, so we halted about 100 yards away and dismounted. We took our Winchesters from their scabbards and moved up to some large rocks where we could find a steady position to shoot from. Both of us were good shots at that range, so we were able to knock down 4 of the bandits before the other 3 were called away on urgent business elsewhere. When the 3 Mexicans left, one of the women picked up a gun and methodically shot each of the bandits in the ear. This made something of a mess, but it ensured that they were dead. We rode up to the stage and found that the driver and guard were dead. There were 2 men and 2 women passengers, and fortunately, one of the men knew how to drive a 6-mule team. We helped the passenger/driver to the box. The bodies of the driver and the guard were tied to the top of the coach, and the dead bandits were tied to their horses. We made quite a parade as we traveled back to town to the stage office. The passengers were put up in the hotel until a new driver and guard could be found. We collected a $100 reward for killing the 4 bandits, and made an additional $63 from selling their mounts, tack, and guns. A very profitable day, overall. We rode on to Lordsburg, but found nothing of interest. Shit. NMT was not as profitable as I had hoped. We decided to head north to see if we could find anything. Maybe we could find something by heading toward the gold fields around Santa Fe. I swear, this was going to be my last trip to MT. Here we were, almost to Santa Fe, and we've only made a total of $95 on this leg of the trip. Surely, we will start finding people pretty soon. This lack of action is driving me crazy, both because I want the money and because I was the one who wanted to go to NMT. I hate to look foolish, and this trip is sure making me look that way. Maybe the town of Fatima will offer us something to work with. We went into the first saloon we came to and found it empty, except for the bartender. Howdy, gents. What can I get my first customers of the day? Jeff said, we'll have a Mexican beer, if you please. Where is everybody? I've never seen a place look so dead. Here you are, 2 Mexican beers. That'll be 24 cents. Thank you. Everybody is out hunting for gold. A new strike was reported off in the hills west of here 2 days ago, and practically the whole town took off. Oh, here come some more customers, so I'll have ta tinta them. Take any seat in the house. It ain't like we're hunting fair space. We sat down near the front door and sipped our beer. Jeff, did you see what I saw? Those look like the Hallett twins. If they are worth $750 apiece. Yeah, and that other galoot is Jacob Uslert. He's good for $600. I wonder what they are doing here, and if there is any more of the gang around. I've got an idea. Trust me. I went out the front door and looked up and down the street, trying to find any more horses. None were to be seen, so it looked like these 3 are the only ones. I went back and sat down. I don't see anybody else, so it should be safe to hit these 3. I'm going to move so that we can get them in a crossfire. Hey, barkeep, which way to the Jakes, if you please? He pointed to a door which was in a very convenient place for my plan. I went to the door and opened it. I stepped partway through so that I could dodge behind it if things got out of hand. I turned around and drew my revolver from my boot holster. Duck out of the way, barkeep. You 3 men are under arrest. Keep your hands away from your guns and I won't shoot. All 3 of the galoots at the bar tried to duck and reach for their guns at the same time. That just doesn't work well when your gun is at your thigh. Try it sometime. I fired 1 shot into the floor between Uslert's legs. He froze while the other 2 slowly raised their hands. Uslert pretended to raise his hands, but he pulled a hideout gun from his waist beside his backbone. That was the signal for Jeff to shoot. He put a bullet into Uslert's side. It was a dead man's hit, because nobody could survive that kind of wound. Uslert fell to the floor, and the other 2 protested that they were not reaching for a gun. Jeff kept them covered while I took their guns and patted them down for additional guns and knives. Man, those Hallett twins were a walking arsenal. I asked the bartender, which way to the marshal's office, if you please? His office and the jail are in the next block, that way. Man, that was a slick capture. Y'all are good. The problem is that the marshal did like most everybody else in town, took off fair the goldfields. No telling when he will be back. Well, I guess we will just have to lock up these men by ourselves. We'll be back for the one on the floor. If he wakes up, ask him to wait on us. We'll be back with some laudanum. Jeff and I marched the 2 twins to the jail and locked them in a cell. We found the keys hanging on a post, so there was no problem getting the cell door open. Just in case, I carried the keys with me when we went back for Uslert. Well, things were a lot simpler than I had expected. Uslert had died while we were at the jail. We stuck the weapons we had piled on the bar into our belts and dragged Uslert to the jail by his feet. We threw his body into another cell and tried to figure what to do next. We had to wait a week for the marshal to show up. We ate our meals by breaking into a restaurant and cooking for ourselves and our prisoners. We figured to pay for the food when the restaurant owner finally showed up. The marshal came into his office and was surprised to see us waiting for him. Jeff said, "Howdy, Marshal. We're bounty hunters. We've got 3 men here we need receipts fair. 2 are alive and 1 is dead. We like fair yatahi ps out, ifin you please." He had to hear the whole story, but he eventually wrote out the receipts for us. We were happy to leave Fatima, but it sure was a profitable visit. We figured to cash in our receipts when we got to Santa Fe. That $2,100 bounty was going to let us get home a little sooner than we expected. We did our business in Santa Fe and left for home. Since we were so far north, I wanted to go by Amarillo to check in on my favorite gunsmith. I didn't buy anything but some ammunition, but we had a pleasant conversation. We got home nearly a month earlier than usual, but everybody was glad to see us. I had trouble recognizing the house. There were 3 wings added to the original house. One was for John and Anne, and they were already living there. Another was earmarked for Florence and Jeff, and Florence was already using it. The last one was for me, and I moved in that first night. Ma kept her room in the old part of the house. She said that there was too much sentimental attachment for her to want to move. Each wing had 3 bedrooms, and Jeff was assigned a different one from Florence. I wondered how long he would be in that room by himself. Now that Jeff was home, Florence wanted the wedding yesterday, if not sooner, but Ma made her agree to contain herself until the preacher was in town Wednesday of next week. I'll bet that is going to work. Huh. I went to bed to a big surprise. I walked into the room and didn't pay any attention to things. I just stripped off my clothes to the light of a kerosene lantern, turned way down, and climbed into bed. I reached over to douse the light when I felt some arms reach around me and bare tits press against my back. Talk about startled. I came close to having to change the sheets. You guessed it. The arms and tits and everything else belonged to Audrey. Audrey had trouble sleeping the whole summer while I was gone. So Ma had agreed to let her sleep with me if I was agreeable. The one requirement was no screwing. We could do anything else we wanted, but that was outside the limits. Well, Audrey practically stuck to me like a tick. I had trouble getting her to loosen up her hold so that I could turn to face her. I was sure that Ma would kill me if she knew that Audrey was in my bed, but Audrey gave me the list of ground rules, so I figured that I could live with them for a while. Anyway, we hugged and kissed for a while, and I taught Audrey how to French kiss. She loved that, so that's what we did until she dropped off to sleep. I guess she did have a sleeping problem if she could go to sleep right in the middle of a kiss. The next day, I asked Ma what was going on. She said, "You know that Audrey idolizes you, and I mean that literally. She ended up sleeping in your bed the whole time you 2 were gone. She wants to marry you, but if you won't, she'll settle for being your mistress. That girl has something in her mind that only you can fulfill. She'd be with you day and night if you'd let her, which is why I told her it was fine to sleep with you, as long as nothing happens, unless you're both willing. Now, the choice really is yours, son. I hate to put this burden on you, but it'll destroy her if you don't let her have you. Do you care enough for her to marry her? Or is she only good enough to be your lover? Or do you want to let her go? I know it's a hard choice to make, especially at your age, but that's where we're at. Ma, I don't know. I really do like her, but I'm not sure I love her enough to marry her. I need some time with her to figure out how I feel. But I'll tell you this, I don't know how long I can keep her in my bed without crossing that line. She wants it, I want it, but you don't want that. Tell me how to stop it." "Well, damn it, son. I know I put you in an impossible situation. Fine, go ahead and do what you need to do. But if she ends up pregnant, you better marry her. I'll tell her about the change in the rules after supper. If I tell her now, she'll be on you constantly until it happens. You 2 will have to figure out the details after tonight." Audrey was all over me the moment after Ma told her of the rule change. Finally, in self-defense, I took her to bed. That girl was absolutely insatiable. Both of us were so sore the next morning that we were walking bow-legged. I guess I should say our bed was a mess. Everybody, even Rose, laughed at us the next morning, but neither one of us cared. Wow, sex is all it's cracked up to be. Ma had asked me to try to quiet Audrey down a little bit, though. She found it somewhat embarrassing when Audrey kept yelling, "Screw me." The wedding for Jeff and Florence wasn't as big as the one for John and Anne. There simply was not enough time between the announcement and the wedding for many people to be able to come. There was a small wedding, But Florence didn't care. She probably would not have even bothered with the preacher, except that Ma insisted. Well, now there was no reason for Florence not to sleep in the bed with Jeff, so Ma quit ridding her on her. I don't know for sure when it happened, but there was no question that, by spring, I wanted to marry Audrey. Ma says that Audrey had wanted me from the day we rescued her, but I ain't real sure about that. I'll just take Ma's word for it. Anyway, we were now both 15 years old and plenty old enough for marriage, so Audrey and Ma set about the plans for the wedding. The preacher was due back in Edgar Junction in 3 weeks, so that was the day they set it up for. Our wedding wasn't quite as big as the one for John and Anne, because not that many people knew Audrey, but the wedding was plenty big enough. The folks held a chivalry for us, too, but this time the chicken had to die. That was no problem. We just had fried chicken for supper the next night. Now that I was a married man, I felt a bit different about leaving home to go bounty hunting. Nevertheless, it had to be done. So Jeff and I headed out on our annual hunt. This time, we headed toward Brownsville, since we had never been that way before. It was less likely that we would be recognized as bounty hunters if we went that way. We thought to follow the river to the Gulf, and then work our way back up the East Coast as far as Louisiana before heading home. We headed toward Laredo to begin our trek. Laredo was a popular jumping-off point for bounty hunters, so we didn't expect to find anything there, but you never know. So we did the saloon-checking routine. Jeff's Spanish was almost as good as mine, so we decided to hit the cantinas as well as the Anglo saloons. Most bounty hunters didn't go to the cantinas because of the animosity they encountered. However, Jeff and I got by right well by dressing the part of the common vaquero and not making a big show. We were just about through the available places when we hit the jackpot. Manuel Ortega was wanted for kidnapping of Anglo women to sell to the sex slave market in Mexico, and there he was, big as life. We couldn't brace him on the spot because he was surrounded by a slew of admirers busily consuming the beer he was buying. Since it was free beer, Jeff and I joined the crowd. Ortega bought round after round of beer for a couple of hours. Jeff and I had to limit ourselves, since we didn't want to be too loose when we finally did brace Ortega. He finally had enough and got up. Ortega answered the pleas for him to stay longer with the answer that he had work to do. That caused our ears to prick up. Maybe we would be able to catch even more of his gang if we played a waiting game. I left the crowd as soon as Ortega made noises about leaving, and I waited outside for him to show up. I could still hear the merriment inside, so I knew that he had not ducked out another way. Ortega came out the front door and kind of staggered down the street. It was obvious that he had been drinking, but it was also obvious that he was still in adequate control of himself so as to be dangerous. I let him get well down the street and was about to follow him when Jeff came out of the cantina. That saved me some bother, and the two of us tailed Ortega as he meandered along. He came to a large livery stable and went inside. We followed him inside, trying to stay unnoticed. There he met 2 other men, and they engaged in a serious conversation. It looked like these 3 were all that were going to be involved, so Jeff and I moved in. I said in my best Hidalgo Spanish, "You peons are under arrest for kidnapping. Put up your hands." Such was the power of class in Mexico that all 3 men complied. Jeff kept them covered while I relieved each one of his weapons and tied his hands behind him. I also tied his ankles together so that he could only take short steps, but not normal ones. Again, using my Hidalgo voice, I rented a horse and wagon and hired a driver to take us to the nearest police station. We turned in our captives and received receipts worth $900. Very nice for an evening's work. Jeff and I figured that we had spent enough time in Laredo, so we headed south, or as near as we could and still be on our side of the river. It was a pleasure to be traveling through verdant countryside, instead of the windswept plains of southern NMT. I guess I'm just a Texas boy, and quite the chauvinist. Oh, well, I like it, and that's what's important to me. We rode into the town of Riverbend, Texas, just in time for dinner, so we found a restaurant. Luckily, this one offered more than just beef and beans. I was able to enjoy a platter of the miscellaneous Mexican goodies that I had developed a taste for during my stay in Mexico a few years ago. I was trying to get Jeff to like it, too, but he seemed to be stuck on beef and beans. We had just finished, paid our bill, and stepped out onto the sidewalk when there arose the clatter of gunfire from up the street. A few moments later, 4 men came tearing by us, firing their guns behind them and riding as fast as their horses would take them. Bullets were flying this way, too. So Jeff and I ducked behind a watering trough and waited it out. Then we heard shouts of bank robbery and don't let them get away. The marshal came charging up the street on his horse, calling for a posse to help him chase the robbers. I started to jump up, but Jeff grabbed my arm. "Hold on, Nathan. The most you can get from join in, the posse is 4 bits and a bunch of saddle sores. Let's play it smart, instead." I had to agree that he had a point, so we walked down to the bank to see what we might work up. There was one dead man dressed in the traditional duster worn by so many bank robbers to hide their shotguns. A man dressed like a bank employee was slightly wounded and being tended to by the local doctor. We went to the manager's office and asked to speak with him. After some negotiation by Jeff, we came away with a paper holding a written promise of $50 for every robber we caught and $250 for returning the loot. That was $450 if we were completely successful, which was certainly worth going for. We went to fetch our horses and set out after the robbers and the posse. They were all tearing away hell-bent for leather, so we weren't going to catch up real soon, but our fresh horses moving at a reasonable pace would let us catch them eventually. We rode along, watching the sides of the trail to be sure the robbers didn't cut away from the trail without the posse noticing. Aha! I spotted where some horses, moving fast, had turned off the well-traveled roadway across an open plain of tall grass. The grass was just beginning to straighten up, and it soon would hide the trail. The posse had missed the sign and had gone pounding ahead without taking time to investigate. The robbers had probably counted on this. They had not counted on someone else spotting the bent grass. Jeff and I picked up our speed a little bit and set out in pursuit. We didn't want to go so fast that we tired out our horses, but we needed to go fast enough to keep up with the bent grass. If we moved too slowly, the grass would return to its normal position before we found the crooks, and that could result in us losing the trail. At least, our horses would be fresher than theirs, so the bandits would have to stop to let their horses rest sometime pretty soon. In fact, we were concerned about coming upon the robbers and surprising us as much as we surprised them. After about an hour, we spotted 4 men ahead of us in the distance. We dropped back a little because we decided that the best time to try to capture them was after they had bedded down for the night. We guessed that, even if they had seen us when we saw them, they would forget about us if they didn't see us again. We stayed back as far as we dared until the sun started to set. Surely, the robbers would take this as a hint that they should stop for the night. This would give us nearly 2 more hours of enough light to follow their trail, as obvious as it was. We could tell from their trail that they had started to slow down and were looking for a good place to camp, so we did the same. We found a good place to shelter as soon as we saw the glow from their campfire. We did not plan to camp here. We were going to use the bandits' camp after we captured them. We ate some pemmican and jerky to hold us for the evening, but we did feel the lack of coffee. Oh well, we would get by on water. We watered the horses, but there was plenty of grass, so they were happy when we hobbled them. We took our rifles and sneaked up on the bandits' camp to watch them until we were ready to pounce. They fixed some beef and beans, and we were jealous of their coffee. They didn't take long to bed down, and one man was detailed to be the guard. Probably, they were going to rotate that chore during the night. We held a short whispered council of war and decided to wait a few hours before hitting them. Jeff took the first watch, and I lay down to get a couple of hours of sleep. One man got up after he had been asleep only about an hour, so Jeff woke me at this unusual occurrence. We heard the man say to the guard, "Joey, I gotta go take a shit. Them beans done got to me. Don't shoot me when I come back." The guard nodded, and the man disappeared in the bushes. This was a God-given opportunity. I went after the man relieving himself while Jeff attended to the guard. Both of us were able to subdue our victims without killing them, so we were ready to move on the other 2 men. Bold as brass, we marched into the camp, and each one of us went up to a sleeping man and poked him with our rifle barrel. There were some grumpy objections, but the men did come awake. We tied up these men still wrapped in their blankets, but after we had taken their weapons, the other 2 were tied up the same way and we relaxed. They were not going anywhere the way they were wrapped tight in those blankets. Pa had taught me that. We arranged them so that their feet pointed away from us so that they could not shoot us, even if we had missed a gun during our search. Jeff and I alternated guard duty until daylight. We had one of the bandits fix breakfast while under guard. The beef and beans were okay, but we were lucky that we had not sampled any of that terrible coffee the night before. We untied the prisoners one at a time and let them relieve themselves and eat breakfast. After that, we tied them back up and checked them again for weapons, just to be safe. We also checked their tack and found several hidden knives. The horses were saddled, and we looked for the bank loot. We found it divided among some of the saddlebags. There was supposed to be $5,347, and a quick count verified that it was all there. The men were tied to their horses by looping a rope under the horse's belly and tying a man's feet to it while they were not in the stirrups. This made it impossible for a man to dismount unaided, and it made it damned painful to ride fast because of pinched balls. Jeff and I made a final cleanup of the campsite, and we started back to River Bend to turn in the crooks and to collect our rewards. Our first stop was at the jail to turn over the bank robbers to the marshal. I showed him the written agreement between the bank manager and us about the rewards, and we counted the recovered loot. We found $5,348. So, as a joke, with the marshal looking on, I pocketed $1. The marshal went with us to collect our reward, and, as expected, the banker didn't want to pay us the rewards he had promised. The marshal insisted that we had a legal contract, so the banker grudgingly paid up. That's when I tossed the extra $1 on the banker's desk and told him that it was a bonus. He looked shocked at our laughs, but I would not tell him the story of that $1. He could get it from the marshal later if he really wanted it. As we left the bank, I tipped the marshal a double eagle. He was grateful, and we parted as friends. We didn't think that there was much point in remaining in Riverbend, so we moved on. We visited 5 more towns without finding any business, so, by the time we got to Cotton Bowl, Texas, we were getting kind of antsy. This was not what you would call much of a town, even for Texas. For one thing, there were only 2 saloons. Now, that was a small town. We went into the first saloon and were startled to see 11 faces from our wanted posters. That was everybody in the saloon but the bartender and the swamper. We had a beer and left before we could be recognized. The other saloon was nearly as bad. There were 11 wanted men in there that we could see, but we gathered that one more of their crew was making use of the saloon 304. What the hell was going on? I hadn't seen this many wanted men at one time since my trip to Las Vegas and MT, and Jeff had never seen that many at once. Since I couldn't control my curiosity, I went to the hotel clerk and asked what he knew about the situation. The explanation was simple. There was a range war going on, and these were the hired guns from both sides. The regular ranch hands stayed at home and worked the ranch, while these 2 gangs stayed in town to drink beer and keep an eye on each other. It was the clerk's opinion that the situation had gotten out of hand, and the ranch owners were more afraid of their hired hands than they were of the other side. I asked some more questions and found that there was an informal agreement between the 2 factions that they could travel back and forth to their respective ranches without drawing fire, but it was open season within the town. I asked why the marshal was putting up with this nonsense, and he said that the marshal had been killed by a gang 6 weeks ago. There was no replacement, so the job was open. Shit, I wish that I could do something about that. Besides, there was a net reward of around $900 to $1,000 walking around Cotton Bowl, Texas. I persuaded Jeff that we had a potential gold mine here if we could find a way to tap it, so we took a room at the hotel. Fortunately, there was a restaurant associated with the hotel. We ate supper, beef and beans, of course, and went to our room to plan our campaign. Considering the dangers involved, neither one of us wanted to go to either saloon. We swapped unworkable idea after unworkable idea until I suggested we just trigger the war and pick up the pieces. If we could knock off 1 or 2 of the galoots on their way through neutral territory and shoot a couple of shots into the crowd in the opposite saloon, we might get them to fighting with each other. Jeff couldn't think of a better idea, so that was what we agreed to do. All of these guys were murderers and most were also assaults, so neither one of us had any qualms about ambushing them. We decided to start our campaign tonight. From what we could tell, the men from the Circle L were the more dangerous of the 2 gangs, so we would make one of them the first ambush target. We had already found out where the rival ranches were located, so we had no trouble finding a good location for our ambush. We decided to hit the first group that came along that was less than 4 people. We figured that we both were such good shots that we could take out 1, 2, or 3 men, but 4 was too many. It was already nearly midnight, but there was plenty of moonlight, so we could see quite well enough. We waited in place about 20 minutes when 4 men came riding along toward us. They were all drunk, so we decided to bend the rule a little bit and take them all out. Once they were close enough, we began shooting. The first 2 went down without a whimper, but the other 2 were not quite so easy. For one thing, the gunshots spooked the horses, so they were moving erratically when we got off our last shots. They never shot back at us. When the shooting was over, there were 3 bodies on the ground, but one was riding madly away, and he was out of range before we could knock him out of the saddle. We knew that he was probably fatally wounded, but when and where he would die was in question. Now, I had an inspiration. We would wait until late tonight and take the 3 bodies into town. We could dump them on the veranda of their saloon and let them be found there by their companions. That ought to raise some ire among the troops. Tomorrow night, we could do the same trick against the Lazy W gang. This ambush worked as well as the first one, except that we killed only 2 members of the gang. We dumped the bodies on the saloon veranda and went to bed. The next day, the town of Cotton Bowl was in turmoil. Every one of the shops were closed, and there were no people on the street. We decided to stir things up even more by shooting into the Circle L saloon. This was a perfect choice, since there was a building across the street with a false front that made a suitable shooting platform. I climbed to the roof of the building to do the shooting, while Jeff stayed on the ground to cover my back in case I needed help. I got into position and waited until somebody showed in the door. I fired my Winchester as soon as he did. I'm sure I killed him. I know at least I wounded him severely. A few moments later, somebody showed up to try to drag the first man away from the door. As soon as he was in proper position, I shot him, too. That was enough. If that didn't rouse the Circle L men into action, I couldn't think of anything else that would. It happened. Around 15 to 20 minutes later, while Jeff and I were waiting in the jail, we heard shooting at the Lazy W Saloon. Somebody was shooting in through the doorway, but using a pistol and standing in the street. This was what we had been waiting for. We climbed back up on a store roof with our rifles to watch what was going on. From there, we saw a man firing from an alley into the Lazy W Saloon, and another was lying behind a watering trough. Because of the shed roof over the sidewalk, we could not see all of the shooters outside the saloon, but we guessed that it was most, if not all, of the remaining Circle L gang. The shooting went on for about an hour without much being accomplished by either side. It looked to me like both sides might be too drunk to hit anything. If that was the case, Jeff and I were going to have to step in to help things along. I suggested that we use a technique that we had used before, where we split up to catch the enemy in a crossfire. I volunteered to go after the Lazy W gang in the saloon, while he concentrated on the Circle L gang outside. I speculated that they might be too drunk to be very dangerous. Jeff thought about the situation for a moment and agreed. We climbed down from the roof, and I swung a wide circle to get behind the Lazy W saloon without being seen. Meanwhile, Jeff switched from his rifle to his pistol since he figured to be very close to his targets. I kept my rifle, just in case. I found the back door to the Jake's. It was open, so I had no trouble seeing inside the saloon. I was surprised at how much light there was inside the building. They would have been much better off if they had killed some of that light. Oh well, I planned to take every advantage that I could get. I slipped up to the door and peeked in. I saw 7 men in various stages of intoxication trying to make shots through the open front door. There was such a clatter of gunfire that I was sure that no one would notice one more pistol added to the noise. I set my rifle aside and drew the modified Star DA from my boot holster. None of the men inside the saloon were protected from my angle, so I started to shoot as fast as I could bring my pistol to the aiming point. There were 9 men in the room and I killed, or severely wounded all 5 that I shot at. They were still so befuddled by drink that the live ones could not find where the new bullets were coming from. I switched guns and continued to shoot. I easily killed the other 4 and stopped to reload both pistols. Jeff had just as easily taken care of the men he was stalking, so we wound up with a flock of corpses that we were going to have to cart somewhere so that we could get bounty credit for them. I didn't enjoy hauling 24 corpses across 17 miles of countryside until we could find a marshal that we could get to take the dead gunslingers and give us receipts. As it was, we had to pay for the funerals. Fortunately, we were able to collect that much when we sold the horses, tack, and guns. Oh well, the $965 in bounties we collected paid for the aggravation. Hell, between the adventures at Laredo, Riverbend, and Cotton Bowl, we had enough money to quit for the summer and we both did miss our wives, so we decided to call it a summer and head home. If we got too bored, we could help John with the farm work. Everybody was surprised and pleased to see us. At least I found out real quick how glad Audrey was to see me. I hardly had time to put up my horse and greet everybody before Audrey had me dragged off to bed. I later found out that Florence had done the same with Jeff. I was right hungry when it came time for breakfast the next day, since Audrey had kept me busy right through supper time. Both of us were a mite chaffed by the experience, but neither one of us cared that much. However, I do think that what kept me from being screwed to death that summer was that Audrey wanted to learn to use a revolver as well as I did. I had no idea why she was so fixed on the idea of learning to shoot, but I knew by now that once that woman got an idea in her head, there was no way to blast it out. As a result, she and I spent at least 2 hours a day, every day, with her learning how to work a pistol. The funny thing was, I had been working with Audrey for only 2 days when Florence showed up, wanting instruction. Well, what the hell? I could teach 2 as easy as I could teach 1. A few days later, Ma, and Rose showed up. I had a regular class, so I stopped them long enough to build a shooting range. We got back to classes as soon as the range was finished. With all the help I got from Jeff and the 5 women, it only took 3 days to build a workable setup. We stuck with it, and the women got to be right good with the modified S&W and Star DA pistols. At the insistence of the women, I had sent a telegram to the gunsmith in Amarillo to ask him to modify 5 more S&WS to double action. A couple of days later, he sent me a telegram that he could have the pistols ready in 5 weeks. Damn, that was good service. I could go to Amarillo to pick them up and be back home before the weather got too cold. I got ready to travel to Amarillo to pick up the guns, and Audrey insisted that she wanted to go, too. Well, the only practical way to go was by horseback, so she had to dress like a man to make that trip with any kind of convenience. I hardly had myself wrapped around the details of taking Audrey with me when Jeff and Florence decided to go with us. Damn it, this was turning into a royal progress march. Jeff agreed to take the responsibility of looking after Florence, so I agreed to go along with the joke. We finally got ourselves together and made up our company of travelers. This time, I insisted on taking a pack mule, since the women had so damned much they wanted to take along. The mule was a special present I bought for myself. It was trained to follow without a lead rope. The women couldn't travel without arms, so I gave each one a modified Star DA to use. That reduced me to only 2 revolvers, but I was reasonably sure that would be enough for this trip. All of us had Winchester .44-40 rifles, though the women hated to shoot them because of the heavy recoil. I was kind of surprised when Jeff asked me to be the leader of the expedition, even though he was older than me. I said okay, so we were finally ready to go. We headed north at a reasonably brisk pace that would save us some time, but would not be so fast that it unduly tired out the horses. I planned on making 40 to 50 miles per day, so our trip to Amarillo should take only about 9 days, 7 if we were lucky. Nevertheless, I had packed enough supplies to last us for 2 weeks. I was never one for taking chances with something like this, and we did have the women along. The first couple of days were spent in shaking us down into traveling shape. The women were not used to spending so much time in the saddle, so we had to make a lot of rest stops those first 2 days. Jeff and I were a little out of practice, so the rest stops didn't hurt us either, though we would never have admitted it to the women. By the 3rd day, though, we only had to make the stops necessary to rest the horses and mule. We always stopped at restaurants for meals if there were any nearby, so we were able to preserve our rations very well. We stopped at hotels each night, and we found that sex was a good way to work out the kinks from sitting in the saddle all day. From that point of view, it was turning out to be a very pleasant trip. At the end of the 9th day, we pulled into Amarillo in plenty of time to find ourselves suitable hotel rooms. We ate some supper, and then the women wanted to see the sights of a town that claimed to have over 1,000 inhabitants. They had their men's clothes on, and they were wearing guns they knew how to use, so Jeff and I figured that it would be safe enough for us to show them some of the wild nightlife of a big city. The first place they wanted to go was to a saloon. They had heard of all of the things that went on in these dens of iniquity, so they wanted to see for themselves. Amarillo had so many saloons that there was no problem in finding one to visit, so we went, though Jeff and I were a little bit anxious. We went into a rather large establishment, and it was full of customers. It was also full of Saloon 304s, and the way they were flashing tits and pussies at potential customers made no secret of their job. The 2 women were embarrassed by the blatant sex, but declined when Jeff and I asked if they wanted to leave. Before we went in, we agreed that the women would answer to Andy and Marty. We didn't dare let it be known that they were women, for fear of the embarrassment that such might cause them. We sat in some chairs along one side of the barroom while Jeff went to the bar for 4 beers. The women had said that they wanted to try everything that they could, so they agreed to sample Mexican beer, which is what Jeff and I drank. He came back with 4 mugs of beer and passed them around. The women sipped as they were instructed, but both made a face when they tasted the brew. They both had drunk wine, but this was their first exposure to beer. Well, Jeff and I didn't have to worry about them drinking down their beer too quickly, so we relaxed over that. Once the ladies had consumed about half of their beer, we took them on a little walk around the room to show them the various gambling possibilities offered. There was faro, blackjack, draw, and stud poker being played at various tables. I told them to watch the faro dealer, and they might be able to see him cheat. I knew that they would never catch him, but it added a little spice to the excitement of the evening. Everybody knew that faro dealers cheated, but they also knew that in an honest house, they only cheated enough to make sure that the house did not lose money. I suspect that part of the fun was in trying to catch the dealer cheating. We spent a total of over 3 hours in the saloon, so it was inevitable that we would spot a face from a wanted poster. I pointed the man out to Audrey, and she wanted to try for an arrest right then. I dissuaded her with the argument that we were not working on this night, so we should let the identification slide. I didn't tell her that such an attempted arrest would probably have resulted in a major gunfight, which I didn't want to get involved in with her around. The next morning, all 4 of us went to see the gunsmith to pick up the new revolvers. This was the first time either Audrey or Florence had ever been inside a gun shop, and they were awe-stricken. I think that this was more impressive to them than the saloon had been. They had to look at every gun on exhibit, and the gunsmith was delighted to have an appreciative audience that would listen while he went over the good and bad points of each weapon, from a Derringer to a 10-gauge shotgun. He even let them dry fire several of the guns, and I have to admit that I learned some things about guns that were new to me. We picked up our new guns and went out back to try them out. Both women were delighted with their new guns, and the gunsmith was impressed at how well they both could shoot. I was embarrassed when the ladies gave full credit to my instruction. We left the gun shop with our guns, and were ready to return home the next morning. We went back on the same route that we had followed on our way to Amarillo, so we knew what to expect at each stop. This made the traveling a lot less stressful. Besides, the women had become completely comfortable in their men's clothes and being in the saddle for such a long time. We ran into our first excitement when we stopped at one of the combination places at a lonely crossroad. Just as we were leaving, a pair of very scruffy-looking men came into the restaurant from the adjacent saloon. Damn, they were wanted and were good for a $300 reward each. I didn't say anything until we were outside, but Jeff started talking at the same time I did. He, too, had recognized the two men. This was too good an opportunity to pass up, so we set an ambush. We had each of the women stand about 20 feet away from the door next to the wall where they could duck behind benches for safety if it became necessary. Jeff and I stood just off the sidewalk at each end of the hitching rail. If we had to, there were watering troughs that we could dive behind. We were far enough apart that somebody stepping out the door could look at one or the other of us, but not at both at the same time. Jeff and I relaxed while we waited for the two men to come out. Man, we could see how the women were a bundle of nerves. I didn't know if they were going to freeze or shoot too soon or what, but we could not worry about them while we were facing two hard cases like these two men. We had to wait for about 40 minutes, and the strain was beginning to tell on Jeff and me. Finally, the two men came out and Jeff, the designated talker, said loud enough to be heard inside the restaurant, "Stop right there. You are under arrest for cattle rustling." The men didn't hesitate. They both drew their guns, but ours went off before theirs did. Our four guns sounded almost as one as all four of us shot at the two men. To my surprise, there were two bullet holes in the two men. Each one had a bullet hole in the side and a bullet hole in the chest, all about heart level. There was no question that they were dead. Several people came rushing to the veranda, and Jeff said, "It's all over, folks. We are bounty hunters and just killed these two men in the process of arresting them for cattle rustling. Can anybody point out their horses?" There was some conversation among the people on the veranda, and they all agreed which two horses belonged to the two dead men. We looted the bodies and came up with $121.32, 4 revolvers, 2 Derringers modified to fire .45 caliber bullets, and 3 knives. We tied the bodies across their saddles and left for the next town. There we got our receipts for the bodies and detoured to the county seat to collect our bounties. The women were thrilled by the total take of over $850 by the time we sold everything but the 2 Derringers. The women wanted to keep them. Boy, was there excitement in our party that night. Both women rightly considered themselves as bona fide bounty hunters. Little did we know how much trouble this was going to cause later on. Back in our rooms that night, the sex matched the mood of the day. When we got home, Audrey and Florence had to tell of their adventures over and over until everybody got sick of hearing the stories. Ma said, "You know that you have raised Audrey's expectations, don't you? She is going to have trouble staying home when you'll go out next summer. And I think that Florence is the same way. If y'all don't knock up your wives pretty damned soon, you're gonna have problems. Get them with child and they'll have other things to think about." Thanks, Ma. I never thought of that. Shit. I didn't know being married could be so complicated. It was 1876 and I was feeling very mature. Audrey and I both were 16 years old and had been married for a little over a year. I guess I was too complacent, but I was caught flat-footed when Audrey announced that she was going out with me this summer. To compound the problem, Florence wanted to go, too, with Jeff. Every argument we offered was answered with the statement to the effect that, "We did fine when we heaped y'all ta capture those cattle rustlers. What makes y'all think that we won't do just as good the next time?" Well, of course I didn't have an answer to that, except that I didn't want to take a chance on one of them being hurt. That always brought up, "How do y'all think we feel when y'all are gone fair so long?" Well, as Ma had warned me, it was inevitable. The wives had worn us down to helpless nubs. Jeff and I both hated it, but we bowed to the inevitable and let them come with us. I sent a telegram to the gunsmith ordering 4 more of the modified S&W revolvers. Shit. At the rate we were going, he could retire on what he made by converting revolvers to double action for us. I got a telegram back saying that he accepted the order and we could pick up the guns in 4 weeks. Well, that pretty well set our direction of travel as we left home that summer of 1876. We headed north in the general direction of Amarillo, figuring to get there in 4 weeks. This time, we didn't take the mule, since we were going for business, not pleasure, and the one thing that Jeff and I refused to give in on was how much fou-fera that the women could take with them. We started out headed in the general direction of Abilene, figuring to swing in a big arc to get to Amarillo in time to pick up the finished guns. We had picked up a slew of posters, a whole new set from the courthouse on our way away from home. It seemed like there were more posters every time we collected a fresh set in the spring. Maybe it was because more of the posters had pictures on them. Whatever the reason, I didn't care. It just meant there was more chance for us to make money. We stopped for dinner at one of those combination places at a crossroads. As we walked out from dinner, a horse came running down the road. There was a bullet wound the back of the rider, and he was on his last legs. Please help us. My wife and kids are at our cabin about 2 miles back. Injuns attacked us. I said, sure, we'll help, but we'll get you inside first. We carried the man into the saloon and laid him on the bar. The problem was that he died before we could do anything for him. All 4 of us ran to our horses and took off in the direction he had come from. We got there in time to see the cabin in flames and no sign of his wife and kids. That's a good sign, in a way. It usually meant that the Indians had decided to adopt the kids into the tribe and to take the woman as a slave. She's probably been assaulted at least once, but she's probably still alive. Well, we were going to do our damnedest to do what we could to help. We caught up to the Indians, Comanches, just past the burning cabin. The 2 kids were on horses riding in front of 2 braves. The children seemed to be in good shape, but the same could not be said for the naked woman walking behind the last Comanche in line. She had a rope tied around her neck, but her hands were not tied. Of course, they didn't need to be. The white woman was not going anywhere as long as that rope was around her neck. Audrey and Florence were all for riding fast to catch up to the Indians and start shooting right away, but Jeff pointed out that all the Indian had to do to kill the woman was to ride faster than she could run. That slowed our 2 women down, but did not quell their desire to kill all of the Comanches. There were 15 Indians, so we had to be careful if we were going to keep the woman alive, and possibly the children too. Jeff and I figured that our best bet would be to wait until the Comanches made camp and hit them then. Florence and Audrey chaffed at the wait, but they finally agreed that we were probably right. We had pulled back as soon as we saw the Indians, and they had given no sign that they had seen us, so we still had surprise on our side. The Indians rode slowly, limited by the speed that their captive could walk, so we had no trouble keeping up with them. Our main concern was the hope that we would not meet any people coming from the other direction, since we didn't want to spook the Comanches. We had ridden for about 4 hours, and the woman in their custody was exhausted, barely able to stay on her feet. It seemed that it was not out of concern for her well-being, but the group decided to stop. 2 of the captors positioned the woman on the ground, her arms and legs spread wide, leaving her vulnerable. The captors ate their meal of dried meat and water, feeding their children but not offering anything to the woman. Her feet were in such bad shape that it seemed unlikely she could walk the next day, and it appeared the captors had plans to finish her off that night. After eating, the captors tied the children's hands behind them and attached a rope to their ankles, securing them to a stake in the ground. The children were too young to escape on their own. We moved out of sight and had our own meal. I instructed everyone to check their rifles and ensure they were fully loaded. Additionally, they were to load 6 rounds into their pistols and be ready to act when I fired the first shot. While I had briefly considered letting the captors tire themselves out, I knew that Florence and Audrey would not stand by and do nothing. I positioned the women and Jeff, pointing out which individuals needed to be targeted first. As soon as the first captor moved into position, I fired the first shot. The other men were standing around, watching as the aggressor positioned himself. Just before he could act, I shot him between the shoulder blades. I was close enough for a headshot, but I wanted to ensure my aim was true. As soon as I fired, chaos erupted. The others returned fire, and the men began to fall. We fired as quickly as we could, reloading and lining up for our next shot. It happened so fast that only 3 of them reached for their rifles, but they didn't get the chance to use them. All the men were down, most of them dead, though a few were seriously wounded. I waited a minute to be sure that it was safe before I stood up. As soon as I was on my feet, Audrey and Florence rushed to the woman. There was not a bullet mark on her, but she was dead. The 2 women then turned to the children to see to their care, leaving Jeff and me to see about the Comanches. Those who were not dead were sure to be that way in a few minutes, so we just left them there, rather than spend the money for another bullet. He and I reloaded, but we could see that the women were not thinking about anything but the children. Jeff and I looked around to make sure that there were no other Indians around to sneak up on us, and there was nothing but 23 horses worth taking from the camp. We decided to move away from this spot and set up our own camp. We were too far from any hotel to spend the night in a bed, so we would just have to use our bedrolls. Jeff and I gathered up the horses and led them to where our own horses were picketed. I looked around and said that we would just spend the night where we were. The next morning, We took the two children to the Crossroads Inn and asked if there was someplace that we could take them. Nobody had any ideas for that, so the wives decided to keep the kids, 2 boys, and raise them as their own. The boys appear to be 3 and 2, approximately, so, kind of arbitrarily, Florence took the older one and Audrey took the younger one. Okay, now what? There was no way around it. The 2 boys were much too young to accompany us even as far as Amarillo. Jeff volunteered to take the women and the kids home while I went to Amarillo to pick up the guns that I had committed for. Jeff was also interested in breeding horses, so he took the Indians' horses with him back to the farm. I didn't push, but I didn't dawdle either. So I got to Amarillo a couple of days before the guns were finished. I hung around until the guns were ready, paid for them, and headed home as fast as I could go without harming my horse. When I got there, I found the 2 boys had settled in real quick to become the latest members of our extended family. The 2 boys, Joey, 3 years old, and Jimmy, 2 years old, were treating all of the adult women as a mother, or, in the case of Ma, as a grandmother. They appear to be very happy and content where they were. Now, the first problem came up. Jeff wanted to stay with his horses and get his business going, instead of going back out with me to hunt outlaws. This, of course, made Florence very happy, but it left me without a partner. I was not real happy with that, since I had gotten used to having one. Oops. Now, the second problem came up. Audrey was ready to resume the bounty hunting adventure with me. She had no interest or incentive to stay home, and plenty of incentive to go with me. Damn it, I was hooked. I had just been complaining about not having a partner, so how could I refuse to take Audrey as my partner? Well, the partnership did have its compensations. Audrey was a damned good shot with steady nerves, so my only legitimate concern was whether or not she would take orders. I bit the bullet and said okay to her joining me as long as she understood that I was the boss when it came to bounty hunting. I wasn't sure how long this agreement was going to last, but I really had no choice. I had to give the partnership a try. We left a week later, headed south toward Laredo. Audrey's Spanish would get her by, but it was nowhere as good as mine. We had to remedy that before we got to Laredo if we could. To do that, we agreed not to use anything but Spanish when we talked to each other. Thank God. All Audrey's Spanish really needed was practice, and the 5 days we took to get to Laredo appeared to be enough to bring it into shape. In that 5 days, Audrey's Spanish got to be as good as mine and much better than Jeff's. There was one other change we had to make. Audrey had to have another name while we were on the road. We settled on Andy for her working name, so that was used when we were practicing our Spanish. I slipped a couple of times the first day, but we were doing fine by the time we got to Laredo. We had picked up a new set of wanted posters, so we were ready to go into business as soon as we got to Laredo. We decided to skip the Anglo saloons and disguised ourselves as a couple of vaqueros. We went through the multitude of cantinas along the river front, but we didn't find anything. However, it was good practice, so we didn't feel like we had wasted our time. We left for the southern leg of our trip and kept drawing blanks. I wondered where the outlaws had gone. This trip was going to be a real bust if we didn't find somebody pretty soon. Finally, we got a break. Audrey had finally developed a taste for Mexican beer, so it was easier to blend in as we visited a saloon. We were sitting in chairs along a wall this day when Andy, punched me in the ribs to call my attention to a galoot standing at the bar. Aha, Big Ear Charlie Henderson. He was worth $300, so he was well worth going after. We waited around to see what he was going to do. Well, what he did was nothing. He nursed a couple of beers, and the day started to turn into evening. As we got further into supper time, the crowd thinned out, but Big Ear Charlie didn't seem like he was going anywhere. It looked like it was up to us to make something happen. I told Andy my plan, and I got up to go back to the bar. Making sure not to get myself between Andy and the quarry, I stood beside him at the bar and stuck my gun muzzle into his side. Mr. Henderson, I'm a bounty hunter, and I am placing you under arrest for train robbery. Please cooperate, and I will not shoot you. Big Ear Charlie caught me completely be surprised by whipping around and pulling a knife. Absolutely, I never thought that somebody could move that fast. Fortunately, Andy had been watching closely, so he drew and fired before I could be cut by a vicious-looking knife. Thank God I had a partner. Otherwise, I would not have lived another 5 minutes. Of course, the bartender wanted to know what was going on, so I gave him the bounty hunter explanation. He sent the swamper to fetch the marshal. When the marshal showed up, I gave him the story and introduced him to my partner, Andy. The marshal was dubious until I showed him the wanted poster I had Andy fetch from my saddlebag. That convinced him, so Andy and I dragged Big Ear to the jail where the marshal wrote up a receipt. We also made a few dollars from the loot, so this was a profitable capture and made up for a lot of the previous aggravation. That night in the hotel, I showed Andy how much I appreciated the backup in the saloon that night. This didn't settle all of my reservations about having Audrey for my partner, but it went a long way in that direction. We rode into Brownsville the next day, and we both saw something that we had never seen before. Sailing ships tied up at docks. Brownsville was not actually on the coast, but the river was navigable the few miles inland to Brownsville, so it had the advantages of a city on the coast. Of course, it also had all of the disadvantages, too. Crime was a fact of life in Brownsville, and the marshal had no way to control it. He settled for keeping it along the waterfront and to a minimum in the main part of town. As a result, the place was wide open near the docks, but very straight-laced a few blocks away. Honestly, I had no idea how this was going to affect our activities. All we could do was take a look. We could always back off if it looked too chancy. We made a point of watching each other's backs as we visited saloons. This was just a reconnoitering run-through, as we looked over what we would have to contend with. I couldn't tell about most saloons, but I was sure that there were several where we would find that the bartender would also be against an arrest. He would be making too much money from the wide-open status to want anything to mess that up. We returned to our hotel room to discuss the situation. I said, "Honey, it looks to me like we would be better off if we just skipped trying for any captures in Brownsville. We could be in a passel of trouble if too many people took exception to us trying for a capture. I know what you mean, but I hate to let all of that money go to waste. Let's look for a big hit and let the small stuff slide. We might be able to get away with that, especially if we waited till we were out of the saloon before the actual capture." "That sounds good to me." "Okay, I can go along with that. It's about midnight. Do you want to go back now, or wait until tomorrow? I feel like some lovin'." "Let's wait till tomorrow." That was all the encouragement I needed to get moving. We had our usual good time and eventually went asleep. Fortunately, the mess ended up on Audrey's side of the bed. The next morning, we had breakfast and spent the day relaxing until dinner. Around 2 p.m., we started our serious search, just as the customers were starting to arrive at the saloons after their meals. The first few places we visited were still relatively quiet, so we moved on quickly. We avoided any locations where we thought the bartender might cause trouble, which meant we had fewer spots to check. Then, we got incredibly lucky. As we were walking out of a saloon, we happened to see Hard McBride walking down the sidewalk toward us. He was a man known for his reputation, and we had a good opportunity to approach him as we weren't inside the saloon when we met him. As he got closer, we split up to make sure he would have to walk between us. Andy moved close to the wall, and I positioned myself toward the street side. Hard McBride didn't slow down, almost as if he believed he was untouchable. When he came within range, I pulled my cross-draw pistol and pressed it against his stomach, making him exhale sharply in surprise. He bent over slightly, trying to recover his breath. I took the opportunity to announce, "Hard McBride, you are under arrest for bank robbery. Come quietly and nobody gets hurt." While he was still bent over, Andy holstered her gun and took a moment to search Hard McBride for hidden weapons. She found one tucked in the small of his back and pulled it out. We decided to leave the one in his boot for now. I reminded him that both Andy and I carried double-action pistols, and even though the hammers weren't cocked, we weren't careless. Any wrong move on his part could be dangerous. We started walking toward the marshal's office, with Andy staying far enough behind to prevent Hard McBride from reaching her suddenly. I walked beside him, with my left arm casually thrown over his shoulders, making it less obvious that my pistol was still pressed against his side. I warned him again about the nature of my weapon, as I really didn't want to shoot him. For one thing, I didn't want to attract too much attention, and for another, I preferred he walk under his own power rather than having to carry him to jail. After a long walk, we reached the jail, and the deputy marshal was surprised to see us with our prisoner. It was his first experience with an arrest made by a bounty hunter, so we had to walk him through the process. Eventually, Hard McBride was locked up in one of the cells, and his hidden derringer was found. He also had a knife in his other boot, which explained why Andy had missed it. Anyway, we got our receipt for the capture and went immediately to the courthouse to redeem it. It was a relief to add that $450 to our money belts, and we decided to leave Brownsville before our luck had a chance to change. A total of $750 in bounties wasn't bad for this early in the trip, but it really wasn't enough to satisfy our needs for the year with the increased size of the family. We didn't want to push our luck too hard in Brownsville, since pushing your luck could be a death warrant. We headed on toward the Gulf, as much as anything, to see it, since it was new to both of us. Damn, that was beautiful. Of course, we weren't the type of people to want to stand and admire something for a long time, so we turned north after about half an hour. The Gulf was nice to look at, but it didn't put groceries on the table. The first town we came to on our trip north was a revelation. These people depended on fish for their livelihood, and they spent a lot of time in boats. We landlubbers stood out like a sore thumb. It was obvious that we were going to have to move inland a bit to find our kind of people. We decided that we should change our original plan and head up towards San Antonio and more nearly into central Texas. This land was not quite as lush as that nearer the Rio Grande, but it was not dry by any means. There were plenty of trees and grass, and there were swamps too, so we didn't lack for bugs. Oh, well, places as nearly perfect as Texas still needed something to remind you of how great the rest of it was. This time, when we rode into a town, we felt more at home. This country was ideal for farms and ranches, so these people were more like home folks. We didn't find any wanted men around here, probably because they were all down in Brownsville, but we knew that we had to come to some as we approached San Antonio. Cities just attracted that kind of person. The next town was much more productive. We saw 4 low-level crooks standing around the town's bank. Were they about to rob it? They were wearing dusters, so they certainly were in uniform for the job. We decided not to wait, since somebody innocent could be hurt if we did, and they really were planning to rob the bank. We dismounted at the next hitching rail, and Andy waited while I approached the men. I could tell that these men were very inexperienced, since they were wearing their dusters so that their guns were covered and not readily accessible. When I got to within about 15 feet of the 4 men, I said, "Gentlemen, you are under arrest for robbery. I am a bounty hunter, and I am with friends who have you covered. Please raise your hands and surrender. That way, nobody will get hurt." Wonder of wonders, 3 of the 4 men did as requested, but one fool went for his gun. Before he could get through his duster and draw his revolver, there were 2 gunshots and he fell dead to the sidewalk. Of course, this drew a crowd, including the town's marshal. He asked, "What's going on here? Who fired those shots?" I answered, "My partner standing over there, and I shot that man. We are bounty hunters, and we had arrested these 4 men for robbery. The dead one resisted arrest and was shot. Please, may we adjourn to the jail so that we can transfer these fugitives to your care?" The marshal agreed, so we disarmed the potential bandits. They did, indeed, have shotguns concealed under their dusters. We collected them, their revolvers, and their knives. It was only a short walk to the jail where the crooks were locked in a cell, and the undertaker was called to take care of the dead one. He had enough cash on him to pay for his funeral, though, for only the $1 minimum fee, the undertaker refused to throw in a wooden coffin. Oh, well, we didn't think that the dead man would care that much. The marshal gave us the 4 receipts, so we had collected $105 worth of bounty, not a fortune, but worth the morning's work. As was customary, we confiscated the guns and sold them, along with the fugitives' horses and tack. This came to $127, so we did right well for little effort and some danger. We were too far from the next town to get there without pushing our horses, so we decided to spend the night where we were and to resume our patrol the next morning. We spent the evening in visiting the 3 saloons in town and retiring to our hotel room. That room was nothing to brag about, but it did have a bed which we put to good use. It's amazing what the danger of dying will do to spice up your sex life. The next morning, we were about 2 miles out of town when we encountered 2 road agents. Obviously, they had seen our successful capture of the fugitives yesterday and thought that we already had the reward money with us. We didn't, but we were carrying close to $1,000 from other sources, so we were reluctant to give up our money. Actually, I'd be damned if I was going to give up without a fight, especially since we would probably be killed before the situation was resolved, even if we did hand our money over. Audrey and I had planned for this sort of occurrence, so we did not need to discuss our defense. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 double eagles, a lot of money in its own right. I said, "This is all I have in my pockets," and reached toward one of the bandits as if to hand him the money. Naturally, he reached out to take it, but I dropped the gold coins on the ground. Both of the bandits automatically looked down to see where the money landed, and that was when Audrey and I drew our guns. It only took 1 shot from each of us to eliminate both of the bandits. They were both dead from bullets in the chest near the heart. They kind of melted off their horses, which had stirred at the sound of the gunshots, but had not otherwise moved. Once the bandits were on the ground, we dismounted. I picked up the 2 coins that I had dropped before examining the nearest bandit. Audrey went to look after the other one. We found a total of $53 between the 2, so this was not a bad way to start the morning. We looted the men and left them lying beside the road, but we took their horses to sell at the next town. We didn't want to return to the previous town, because we were likely to attract more unwelcome attention. The next town was somewhat larger than the last one, so there were 4 saloons and 3 livery stables. We got a good price for the horses and tack, and an acceptable price for their guns, etc. It took most of the rest of the day to visit all 4 saloons, so we spent the night in the town's only hotel. We didn't find anything worthy of our attention in this town, so we moved on the next morning. We drew a blank in the rest of the towns we visited before reaching San Antonio. This was a city of about 800 permanent residents, so they had 7 saloons and 2 separate brothels. Surely, a city of this size would attract enough crooks to make our visit worthwhile. It was late in the day when we got to San Antonio, so we checked into a hotel that had its own stable where we left our horses. We ate a very good supper of Mexican cuisine and started our visits to the saloons. We thought we had struck gold when we visited the second saloon on our list. We saw Sam Fields at the bar, and were about to approach him when he was accosted by another bounty hunter. It would not have been honorable for us to move in on his arrest, so we sat down in chairs at the side of the barroom to watch the show. It was always possible to learn from a fellow professional's actions, but this bounty hunter seemed to do everything wrong. For one thing, he talked so loud that he could be heard all over the barroom, so everybody knew that he was a bounty hunter making an arrest. He had drawn his pistol, but he had not cocked it. In fact, his thumb was not even on the hammer. Either he had a double-action pistol, or he had a serious lack of smarts. Fields turned to face the arresting bounty hunter and spit in his face. This was so surprising that the bounty hunter was distracted and paused to wipe his face. When he did this, 3 shots rang out, one from Sam Fields, and one each from 2 men standing by a table. I said to Audrey, "You take Fields, I'll get the other 2. We both drew and fired from our cross-draw holsters. Scratch 3 galoots who deserved to die. Audrey had put a bullet into Fields' left kidney and another between his shoulder blades. My bullets had struck my target squarely in the chest, so I needed only 1 bullet for each one. We looked closely at the rest of the patrons, and nobody seemed interested in continuing the battle. We kept our guns out as we went to examine our kills. I found that the 2 dead men that I had shot were both on wanted posters, one for $100 and the other for $125. Sam Fields was good for $800, so we had really struck it rich. It took a couple of minutes for a deputy marshal to show up, so Audrey and I had time to concoct a plan. I talked to the deputy and claimed that we were partners of the dead bounty hunter, so that was why we had shot the other 2 crooks without warning them first. I claimed that we had been trying to protect our partner from further harm. He bought it, but he had no reason not to. After all, the other people had shot first. Anyway, we claimed credit for the capture of Sam Fields and his 2 friends. We looted the bodies while the deputy sent for the undertaker and a wagon to move the corpses to the undertaker's funeral parlor. The dead bounty hunter had no identification, so we never knew who he was. He was carrying $400 in his money belt, so we took that. We used $10 of it to pay for a nice funeral under the name of Bill Smith, for lack of anything better. The marshal insisted that we pay for the other 3 funerals, too, so we grudgingly paid the $1 each for the minimum in funerals. By the time we had gotten everything we could from the adventure, we had almost $1,900 to show for the event. We now had enough money to pay for the summer's trip and decided to go home. Besides, Audrey was having trouble keeping her breakfast down, and she was feeling generally peaked in the mornings. We weren't sure what her problem was, but we had an idea, so we figured that it was time to head home. Anyway, by the time we got home, Audrey was certain that she was knocked up, and the both of us were on top of the world. We were so happy that we practically sang our way home. This was the event that Audrey had been hoping for, and trying to make it happen was one of the major reasons that she had wanted to travel with me in the summer. I wish that she had told me. I think that I would have been more agreeable to her going along. The whole family was as happy as we were, and my only regret was that Audrey would no longer be able to travel with me. On the other hand, Jeff had gotten bored with the day-to-day details of running a horse breeding and trading business, so he was ready to return to the bounty hunting life. Florence knew all that she needed to know about running the horse business, so she had no qualms about taking over. Besides, she was knocked up too. John had agreed to front the business for those customers who were reluctant to deal with a woman. This was 1876, the year that saw the start of the Great Indian War. Trouble had already started with the Cheyenne and Sioux, but with the defeat of Custer at the Little Big Horn, the war spread to the Comanche and Kiowa nations. Very soon, the whole country west of the Mississippi River was embroiled in a war that was going to see a lot of people killed, both white and Indian. About the only Indians not fully at war with the whites were the Mescalero Apaches, who had usually gotten along well with the whites. I was glad that I was now home so that I could help defend our farm from marauding Indians, mostly Comanche, but a few Kiowa. Fortunately, most all of the farm work that had to be down well away from the house was already completed, and there would not be much to do until harvest time. Well, we'd worry about that when the time came. We knew that any Indians who came our way would mostly be interested in the horses, so we brought them in close to the house so that we could keep an eye on them. While we waited, I made a point of refreshing the marksmanship training of the women who had not had much occasion to shoot in the last couple of years. We had plenty of guns, and we went through a lot of bullets, bringing their abilities to the peak. None of them were going to win any contest with their shooting, but they were good enough to take care of themselves in a pinch. Florence's baby was born in late summer. It was a girl they named Elizabeth. Audrey was bulging pretty good, but she had a few months to go. Yet, the women busied themselves in motherhood duties, and we men went around preparing for what we hoped would never happen, an Indian raid. The Indians left us alone all summer right up until harvest time. That's when our preparations paid off. When the time came for harvest, John had always hired a few local people and a few Mexicans for the hard physical work. John always went out to supervise, but Jeff and I went along on guard duty considering the nature of the Indian problem. The Anglos all had guns with them, but the Mexicans didn't. Anyway, we were just about ready for the mid-morning break when 12 Kiowa warriors rode into sight. They were so near like their Comanche relatives that the difference was a technicality. We hoped that they would ignore us, but no such luck. Today's harvest was wheat, so all of the workers had scythes, and the Mexicans planned to use them as weapons. The Anglos had their rifles and revolvers, so we were well armed and actually outnumbered the Indians 14-12. The Kiowas, so sure of their superiority in war, didn't hesitate to attack. They rode at us in the classic cavalry attack, expecting us to panic and run. Of course, we didn't. As soon as we were certain that they were going to attack, we gathered behind the farm wagons which were lined up almost at a right angle to the Kiowas. The Anglos all lay on the ground under the wagons to get a good, reasonably safe, shooting position. Most of us had Winchesters, though a few still used Benjamins. The Mexicans stood behind the wagons with their scythes, ready to handle any enemy who got close enough. We started shooting when the charging Kiowas closed to 50 yards and kept shooting as they charged. The Kiowas shot back, of course. We were not really worried about the shooting from the running horse, except for the lucky accident. However, it is not as easy as it seems to shoot a charging foe, even when you are in a prone position on the solid ground. The excitement gets to you, and you tend to shoot before you have a good sight picture. We knocked off a few of the charging Kiowas, but they never slowed down. When they got to the wagons, their horses jumped over the wagons in a great show of machismo. That was their undoing. The Mexicans stood firm as if there was no way they could be harmed, though, of course, there were actually many ways that they could be seriously injured or killed. I couldn't help gazing in awe at the courage exhibited by those Mexicans as they stood there waiting for the Indians to get close enough. As soon as an Indian and his horse was close enough, a Mexican used his scythe to gut the leaping horse. Of course, this caused the horse to crash to the ground, seriously injuring or killing the Kiowa rider. Those that were not killed by the fall were beheaded by a deft application of the scythe blade. Remind me never to make a Mexican peon mad at me while he is holding a sharp blade. That ended the attack with all of the Indians dead and many of their horses the same way. A couple of hours were spent in cleaning up the mess, and then the workers returned to the harvest. It wouldn't wait. That evening, every man received a $1 bonus for his brave actions that day. The $1 was almost a week's pay, so it was gratefully received. Thank God, that was the only attack we had to face that year. When spring came, Jeff and I headed out, leaving the mothers behind. There had been a lot of good things I could say about having Audrey along with me, but I was still relieved that she was staying home this time. She had children to concern her, now, so she would not be fretting so much about me and my safety. Jeff and I thought that we would take a close look at Central Texas this time. Something had always happened to keep me from making a full sweep, so I was sure that there were wanted men there that I had missed. We hoped this time we could get all the way through without having to cut our trip short. This time, we headed toward Austin instead of Laredo. It really didn't make that much difference, but we had never taken the Austin road before, so we might as well give it a try. The second day into the trip, we hit pay dirt. We just didn't know it at first. We rode into a small town, and the first thing we noticed was that the street was empty. That seemed odd for the middle of the afternoon. Normally, only siesta time would empty streets this thoroughly, but there did not seem to be enough Mexicans in this part of Texas to warrant that. Still wondering what the story was, we hitched our horses to the rail and went into a saloon to ask what was going on, or wasn't going on, as the case may be. The bartender informed us that there had been a bank robbery that morning and nearly every man in town was out chasing the crooks. The marshal had formed a posse and they were chasing the galoots somewhere southeast of town. Jeff and I ordered a beer and sat down to discuss the possibilities offered by this occurrence. We finished our beers and headed down to the bank to ask if a reward had been posted. When we got to the bank, the manager brushed us off, assuring us that the marshal would take care of everything. Well, that manager was such a shit that we wanted nothing to do with his troubles. He wouldn't even tell us how much money had been taken in the loot. We decided to hell with it and got back on our horses. If that was the way the bank manager was going to act, he could hunt for the loot all by himself, as far as we were concerned. We rode out of town in a generally northeasterly direction toward Austin. We passed through a couple of towns without finding anything of interest and were beginning to wonder if we were on a wild goose chase. On our third day, we happened upon a horse lying on the ground suffering from a broken leg that must have come from stepping in a hole in the ground. The dead rider was lying close by. He had a broken neck and a compound fracture of his right leg. We shot the horse in the head, since there was nothing else we could do for it. Apparently, when the horse fell, he had thrown the rider, and that resulted in the broken bones. We searched the rider and found absolutely no means of identification, so there was no way we could contact relatives. We did the only thing reasonable and searched the man for any valuables we might be able to use. Damn it, this galoot was a walking arsenal. He had 4 revolvers, a derringer, and 3 knives. On top of that, he had 2 Winchesters carried in scabbards on his saddle. The only people we knew of who went around that well-armed were gunslingers and bandits, and there was often very little difference between the two. He was not wearing a money belt, so we carefully checked his saddlebags. That's when we struck the paydirt I mentioned. He had $2,357 in gold and silver in a bag and among his other stuff. We guessed that it must be part of the loot from that bank robbery a few days earlier, but we had no way to know for sure. The man was not on one of our wanted posters, so he could have a legitimate reason to carry that much money. That banker had been such a shit when we talked to him that we were not going to ride all the way back to his bank just to be insulted again. Therefore, we pocketed the money and took the guns, etc. to sell in the next town. By the time we were through with selling our loot, we were ahead nearly $2,500, so that was a good way to start the summer of 1877. We were not nearly so annoyed with our luck as we had been when we started the morning. We never did travel all the way to Austin. We figured that there were so many lawmen in Austin that no wanted man would be stupid enough to hang around that town. Instead, when we came to a likely-looking trail headed south, we turned toward San Antonio. We'd gone about 5 miles when we came to a nice-looking little town. It must have had about 50 people living in and around it. It was still large enough to have 2 saloons, so we stopped off to hear any local gossip. We were talking to the bartender when we heard a commotion in the back of the barroom. The bartender groaned and said, "Shit, that a-hole is at it again. My swamper ain't too bright, and Jasper likes to devil him whenever he has too much to drink." We turned to look, and Jeff said, "That's Jasper Swaggart. He's worth $75. Let's get him." I nodded agreement, and we walked to the other side of the barroom, me on one side and Jeff on the other so that we would not present too tempting a target. I let Jeff handle the arrest since he was the one who spotted Swaggart. "Jasper Swaggart, I'm a bounty hunter. You are under arrest fair robbery. Surrender now, and nobody will get hurt." Swaggart let out a roar and swung at Jeff's belly with a Bowie knife he had been using to threaten the swamper. I didn't even have time to think. I just reacted automatically. I drew and put a bullet through Swaggart's chest and was aiming to fire again when the bully fell to the floor. Well, that was the end of that confrontation. Jeff called to the bartender to send somebody to fetch the marshal, but the bartender said that the town didn't have one. However, he did thank us for ridding the town of the troublemaker. The swamper did help move Swaggart's body to his horse after we had looted it. Jeff tipped the swamper $1 out of pity for the torment Swaggart had put him through the last year or so. The swamper was very happy at this, so we left for the nearest town with a marshal where we could turn in the body and get a receipt. The weather sure was acting crazy. We had not had any rain for a month, and now it was pouring rain like it was water out of a bucket. We were miserable, and our horses were miserable. The wind was blowing hard enough to make the rain that much worse, and the trees were shedding leaves like winter was coming on. Crack. It sounded like a big limb fell, or maybe even a whole tree. The noise was so loud. Following on the heels of that was the sound of a woman screaming. Jeff and I hurried up to see if there was something that we could do to help, because the woman was obviously in some sort of bad trouble. Shit. What a tragic mess. A covered wagon had been passing under a tree when the whole thing fell, and a broken stub of a limb struck the driver. From 100 feet away, we could see that the man was dead. The stub of limb had hit the man in the top of his head as the tree fell, and had stabbed right through his head and into his body. The tree had continued to fall even farther, and had crushed his body into the driver's seat and the bed of the wagon. A woman was standing right behind the driver, as close as the fallen tree would let her get. She was beating her fists in futility against the tree trunk and screaming as if she was announcing the end of the world. I guess she probably was if she had been married to the man. If so, She was a widow now. We rode up to the wagon, and I climbed up and into the wagon bed. As gently as I could, I pulled and urged the woman to move back into the shelter of the canvas top. She fought me at first, but she finally collapsed against me and buried her face in my shoulder. She cried so hard that I began to worry about her, but she eventually calmed down enough that I was able to get her to lie down on some blankets that were laid out on the wagon bed. I persuaded her to try to sleep while Jeff and I worked on getting the wagon from under the tree. Jeff and I were already as wet as a body could get under those circumstances, so we just ignored the rain and tried to figure out how to release the wagon. After examining the tree more carefully, we found that the tree trunk itself was not pressing on the wagon. It should be possible to pull the wagon from under the tree if we cut off the limb that was stabbed into the man and stuck through a hole of its own, making in the driver's seat. We looked at the tools fastened to the side of the wagon and found a two-man crosscut saw that we could use to separate the limb from the rest of the tree. Once that was done, we should be able to pull the wagon backwards to free it from the tree. As it was, the tree was just too damned big for us to do anything about it. The county was going to have to send out a crew with proper tools and enough mules to clear that tree out of the roadway. Jeff and I were able to saw the limb off, but we wound up making an even bigger mess of the dead man's head. We didn't worry about it too much, since he was in no position to complain. Fortunately, the woman had gone to sleep, so we were able to work the tree limb and the man out of the driver's seat without her seeing what a mess the tree had made of the man. The body and the limb were so thoroughly bound together that we made no effort to separate the two. We used the spade and shovel also attached to the wagon to dig a shallow grave, and we put the man in it before the woman woke up. The rain was finally doing some good. The water was falling so fast that the blood and shit were washed off the seat and out of the wagon before the woman woke up. We unhitched the two mules that were pulling the wagon and carefully led them through the mud and muck to the rear of the wagon where we chained them to its rear end. It took amazingly little work to pull the wagon backwards from under the tree. Jeff led the mules while I steered the front wheels with the stub of the wagon tongue. It took less than 15 minutes to get free from the tree once we were ready to try for it. We pulled the wagon backwards far enough to rehitch the mules to the proper place in the front and turn the wagon around. It turned out that Jeff was a marvel at driving that wagon. The rain finally stopped as he got the wagon turned around. I hitched our two horses to the rear of the wagon and climbed up to ride on the driver's seat next to him. The woman was still sleeping on her makeshift bed. It was nearly dark, and we were exhausted by our labors, so we stopped at one of those combination inns that one finds at major crossroads. I went in to negotiate for hotel rooms, while Jeff woke the woman and helped her into the hotel lobby. Strangely, the woman did not want to give her name to the hotel clerk, so she registered as Jane Smith. We went into the restaurant for the usual beef and beans supper. At least, the coffee was a rarity. It tasted pretty good, and it was sure hot. After supper, Jeff and I escorted the woman to her room, and she asked us to come in for a few minutes to talk. It was certainly unusual for a decent woman to invite strange men into her bedroom, but we were curious, so we joined her. She already knew our names from the room registration, so hers was the only one in question. She introduced herself as Mary Hofstetler. No, that was not her husband who had been killed by the tree. It was just a man who owned a wagon whom she had hired to drive for her. Her story was that she was being forced into a marriage with a much older man whom she detested, so she was running away from home. Her hysteria when we found her was caused by her fear that she would now have to return home. Mary started to cry and explained that she would do anything to keep from having to return home. She would even turn to prostitution, if necessary, to pay her way, but she simply would kill herself rather than marry that man her father was pushing her toward. Jeff and I looked at each other and nodded. Here we go again. Another damsel in distress that it was up to us to rescue. Oh, what the hell? We already had enough money for this summer's trip, so we could take Mary home with us. Ma could figure out what to do with her. I told her that she could return home with us and something would be worked out to take care of her. Mary was so relieved that she practically attacked me with hugs and kisses. Jeff and I went to our room and went to bed. We were both so tired that it took almost no time for us to fall asleep. The next morning, the three of us met for breakfast. It turned out that Mary could drive the mules. That man had been driving simply because he had owned the mule and wagon. To our relief, Mary drove the wagon while Jeff and I were free to ride our horses. We did not push very hard, so it took us several weeks to get home. When we got there, I had a bit of a problem explaining to my wife why I was traveling with a woman. Ma finally had to tell Audrey to back off. Her jealousy was totally unfounded. Damn, I'd be glad when that baby finally got here so Audrey would return to her normal self. Audrey's pregnancy only had a few weeks left to run, so I just gritted my teeth and held on to my temper. Mary was welcomed into the family by Ma, so that made it official. Mary was 16 years old, so she was prime marrying age, if not pushing it a little late. Ma would do something about that pretty quick. In Texas, any woman who was willing to get married never suffered for lack of suitors, no matter what she looked like. Mary looked good, so she would soon be beating off the men with a stick, if Ma had anything to do with it. The first step in the campaign was to take Mary to the church meeting. That affair lasted all day, so there was plenty of time to introduce her to every eligible male in the vicinity. We had enough money, so Ma would provide Mary with an adequate dowry. Besides a connection with our family, no matter how tenuous, was still a very valuable thing. Anyway, Mary's prospects looked good, so none of us worried about her future. Mary was thrilled by the support and attention she was getting, and was as happy as a girl her age could be. Audrey was unhappy over all of this activity, not because she begrudged Mary her chance at happiness, but because she was locked out by social convention. Audrey's belly was bulging so much that it triggered thoughts of triplets, at least, and no woman wanted to be seen in public while she bulged that much. Personally, I thought the sight of a knocked-up woman was beautiful, but women didn't think that way for some reason I couldn't understand. I tried to console Audrey with the thought that she would have delivered the baby before Mary was committed, so she would have plenty of time to put her or into the stream. Audrey had to admit that I was right, but she still begrudged all the fun she was missing. I couldn't help thinking that women worried about the funniest things. At last, those last dragging weeks had lumbered by and Audrey went into labor. We didn't lack for midwives, so Audrey had all of the care she could use. On the other hand, I was going crazy with worry. I knew that most women had babies without problems and had been doing that since the Garden of Eden. I don't know how I got through the birth. Everybody agreed that it was harder on me than it was on Audrey. Her labor lasted only 9 hours, but that was 9 hours of agony for me. After some strain on Audrey and a whole lot of strain on me, Audrey delivered twins, a boy she named Thomas Houston Parker, Jr. and a girl she named Audrey and Parker, after I insisted. Never had there been 2 more beautiful kids been born anywhere within the state of Texas. I would concede the possibility of some outside the state, but that didn't count and was of no importance. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.